welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies and TV shows with history. With spooky season upon us, today we're pulling another classic episode from the vault. Actually, more than that, we're going to do 3 episodes, all about the same TV series, History Channel's Project Blue Book. In case the title alone doesn't tell you what it's about, Project Blue Book was the code name for the United States Air Force's systematic study of UFOs. Perhaps the best way to summarize it is from this fact sheet from the Air Force themselves. And I'll add a link to the whole thing in the show notes if you want to read it all, but it starts like this. From 1947 to 1969, the Air Force investigated unidentified flying objects under Project Blue Book. The project, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, was terminated December 17, 1969. Of a total of 12,618 sightings reported to Project Blue Book, 701 remained unidentified. Now, if you're watching the video version of this, you might notice some of my little corrections to that document because technically Project Blue Book itself didn't start in 1947. The truth is a little more complex than that, as we'll hear throughout this episode. But as you might imagine, the TV show that shares the name of the Air Force's Project Blue Book covers some of those reports. Created by David O'Leary, Project Blue Book ran for 2 seasons of 10 episodes each. The first season was in 2019, and the second in 2020. So that means we have a lot to cover today. And to kick this off, we'll get to hear from the host of one of my all-time favorite UFO-related podcasts, Rob Kristoffersen. He'll help us separate fact from fiction in each episode of the entire series, both seasons. So that's 2 episodes, 1 for each season. And then for the 3rd episode, we'll get to go behind the TV show itself as we hear from the creator, David O'Leary, and the showrunner, Sean Jablonski. Before we kick this off with Rob Kristoffersen, though, let's set up our game, 2 Truths and a Lie, for the 1st season of Project Blue Book. Now, if you're new to the show, since Based on a True Story is all about separating fact from fiction in the movies and TV, you'll get to practice your skills at separating fact from fiction in this podcast episode with the game of 2 Truths and a Lie. So I'm about to give you 3 things that we'll talk about during the 1st season of Project Blue Book. 2 of those things are true, and 1 of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1. Project Blue Book was the first time the government investigated UFOs. Number 2. Former Nazi Wernher von Braun teamed up with Walt Disney to promote the U.S. space program after World War II. Number 3. The term Foo Fighters was used by World War II pilots who saw unexplained phenomena. Got 'em? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, see if you can figure out which one of those is a lie. And I've got the answer in the envelope right here, and we'll open that at the end of season 1 of Project Blue Book to see how well you did. Oh, and speaking of the video version here, just so you know, these episodes are from the vault. They were recorded in 2020 and 2021, respectively, and that was before I did video episodes, so these are remastered audio-only episodes. But with that, now it's time to play back my chat with Rob Kristoffersen from 2020 about the historical accuracy of Project Blue Book Season 1. I'd like to start by setting the stage for Dr. J. Allen Hynek and his work on Project Blue Book. According to the TV show, Dr. Hynek was an astrophysics teacher at Ohio State before he's recruited by the U.S. Air Force to investigate flying saucers, what they called Project Blue Book. Now, there's one little bit of dialogue in the show where they give a very vague reason as to why they picked Dr. Hynek. And it's when General James Harding tells Captain Michael Quinn that Hynek, quote, did some things for us in the war, end quote. So not a lot of details there about that, but they do give some details about why they started Project Blue Book itself. Now, the reason that the show gives for that was because there are Hollywood movies about aliens coming out and the public knows something's going on, but no one knows exactly what, including the government, according to the show, so they want to find out. But they also want to cover it up. We get the sense from the show that the military picked Hynek because of his scientific background, because he's not in the military. They're hoping that they can give a little bit of some scientific proof to the public for flying saucers that's outside of the military. Now, in the show, Dr. Hynek agrees to join Project Blue Book on 3 conditions. One is that he stays on staff at Ohio State. 2 is he gets a paycheck from the government, some extra money for his family. And 3 is that he gets recognition for whatever he finds. So that is according to this TV show, kind of setting all of this up. How well do you think the show did depicting the way that Dr. Hynek got involved in Project Blue Book?
So Dr. Hynek's joining Project Blue Book was kind of a matter of convenience almost. So when Project Blue Book comes into being in late 1951, this is essentially the government's 3rd attempt to study the UFO phenomenon. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek was part of the government's first UFO study, which was called Project Sign. Sign commenced in January of 1948 and was shuttered later that year. He joined the project in the spring of 48 for a few different reasons. He was, at the time, the director of the observatory at Ohio State University. All of the government's UFO projects were run out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which was about 60 miles away from him. And Hynek already had a high security clearance from his work on the proximity fuse during World War II, which is what they kind of allude to him doing things for us during the war. And when you factor in all of these things, Hynek was kind of the guy. They needed an astronomer to rule out any kind of astronomical explanation that there could be for the sightings. And he was a perfect guy to do it. So, as our good friend Sam stated on the Not Alone podcast, right place, right time, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
I love that.
So, when Hynek took the job, he believed that this would be a quick one. He was pretty sure that what the UFO phenomenon was at the time was just Cold War nerves, World War II latent nerves, stuff left over. So, one of the most important cases that Hynek worked on, and that will come full circle for his involvement in Project Blue Book, is a case involving a pilot by the name of Thomas F. Mantell, who died while in pursuit of a UFO in January of 1948. Mantell and a few other pilots were taxiing planes from Marietta, Georgia to Standiford Field in Kentucky. And while they were doing that, Godman Air Force Base, which was located near Fort Knox, had received a few unidentified blips on their radar and asked Mantell and his crew of a few other pilots to go investigate it. Well, Mantell pursued the object, but unfortunately, he didn't have oxygen on board. So when his plane climbed too high, he suffered from hypoxia, which basically caused him to crash his plane. And Hynek was the one that kind of made his determination on this case. And he claimed that he was chasing the planet Venus. So really just kind of debunking mentality. And that was at the start of Project Sign. That was the mentality that J. Allen Hynek had. So Project Sign was basically shuttered largely because of a document called The Estimate of the Situation, which basically said that these crafts were extraterrestrial in origin. No surviving copy of this document exists, though. The generals that this report went to basically said, you have to destroy every single one of these documents. There's no way that we're going to the president or anybody with this kind of information. So no surviving copy has ever been found, but there have been people who have attested to it, including Dr. Hynek himself. So Sign was shuttered and was reactivated as Project Grudge. Now, Grudge was strictly a debunking campaign. They downplayed reports and at times just threw them out, didn't even bother to investigate them. Grudge officially lasted for about a year, but they kind of kept somebody on staff so that if somebody did want to report UFO sightings too, there would be somebody there. And that guy's name was Lieutenant Jerry Cummings. And in 1951, there was a sighting at Monmouth, New Jersey, and Air Force personnel witnessed a disc-shaped object, and a report was filed, but was ultimately dismissed by Cummings under the directive that he had been working with. And this report made its name to a general by the name of C.P. Cabell, who requested to see the report and didn't really like the looks of it. He didn't feel like people were being honest with him. And Cummings basically told him how the project had been handled up to this point, that it was there just to debunk reports. And at that point, Cabell got pretty angry, and he ordered that Project Grudge be reactivated in full force. Unfortunately, Cummings was on his way out back to his civilian life, so he got a gentleman by the name of Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was the first Project Blue Book head to spearhead this project. So Captain Ruppelt was essentially the backup pilot for the crew of the Enola Gay. So if any of the pilots that were involved in that flight couldn't somehow make it for whatever reason, he was the guy that was going to fly that plane. And he had worked with Dr. Hynek before on Project Sign. And he quickly got in there. He whipped this project into shape, and soon it would be relabeled Project Blue Book. But one of the things that he did was he went back into the old reports just to see what was there, to see how things were ruled. And Ruppelt was the kind of guy who was going to give you his objective opinion. He wanted this to be as an objective study as possible. So if you leaned one way, either one way to one side or the other, you were kicked off the team. So one case report that he looked at was the Thomas F. Mantell case, and he saw that Hynek was the one that made the determination on that one. So he basically called him up and said, I need you to come back in here. We need to re-examine this case. They determined that what Mantell was chasing was a Project Mogul balloon. This was a newly declassified project as of 1951 that essentially sent up weather balloons to with audio equipment attached to them, and they were basically there to detect Soviet atomic bomb tests. And that's basically how Hynek made his way onto Project Blue Book. He stayed after that through the entirety of the project.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, there was a captain, because in the show there's Captain Quinn, and we also meet a couple generals, General Harding and General Valentine are the character names. Were they based on those generals and the captain that you were referring to, or are they just completely fictional?
They're inspired. They're not totally those people. For instance, Captain Quinn is kind of based on two Project Blue Book heads, Edward Ruppelt, like I mentioned, and another one by the name of Colonel Robert Friend, who was a Tuskegee Airman, and he served, I think, for about a year. But he had that Edward Ruppelt mentality, which was they were skeptical, but they wouldn't let their skeptical beliefs really shutter any kind of reports or anything like that, or lead them down a road they didn't think they should be going. And General Valentine, I do believe, is based on General Nathan Twining, who was the general that actually created Project Sign, and he was kind of a figure in the background during the government UFO research projects. So he was always kind of there in the background, always kind of got intel, and he's, made some interesting statements on UFOs and such. There's some fun interviews with him. There's one in which he alludes to UFOs kind of thwarting U.S. forces in Vietnam and stuff like that. It's there's a lot of fun stuff out there.
Well, yeah, okay. I was just curious because obviously Dr. Hynek being real, I was just curious who on the military side of it would have been real, but it sounds like they're more just composite characters, which is very common that we get for movies and TV shows.
Yeah, for the most part, the only real to life characters on the show are Dr. J. Allen Hynek and his wife Mimi Hynek.
You mentioned the pilot there, and that leads right into the next question that I have, because in episode 1, it kicks off with something that they call the Fuller incident. Now, I'm going to assume that's not necessarily the same incident that you were referring to, because this, in the show at least, happens in Fargo, North Dakota, and it's named after Lieutenant Henry Fuller, who is the pilot who gets into this dogfight with a flying saucer. And according to the show, that was essentially the reason why they started Project Blue Book. But then after the investigation of the incident, Dr. Hynek concludes that the object the lieutenant was chasing was nothing more than a weather balloon. And you mentioned something similar to that. So was the Fuller incident that we see in the show that event that you were referring to, or was that something else?
No, that's a little bit different. It has some of the hallmarks of the Thomas F. Mantell case, but the Fuller incident is based directly on an incident called the Gorman dogfight. And this involved a man by the name of George F. Gorman, who was an Air National Guard pilot out of Fargo, North Dakota. And on October 1st, 1948, his squadron was returning from a flight at night, and Gorman decided he wanted to stay up in the air for a little bit longer for some night flying practice. And after circling around a football stadium, this was around 9 p.m. that night, he was approaching Hector Airport and was notified by the tower that there was a Piper Cub plane below him. And he was forced to circle the airport for a short period of time. And on one pass, he saw what he believed to be the tail light of another craft pass the Piper Cub plane on his right. It was white in color, blinking in intervals, and approximately 6 to 8 inches in diameter. So this object was not registering on radar in any way, but he went in to investigate it. And when Gorman made his approach, the light stopped blinking and basically just took off. And Gorman engaged with the object. He pursued it. He found himself outmaneuvered basically at every turn, but was able to get behind it at one point. But when he did, the object basically turned around and flew straight in his direction. It passed right over his canopy and turned around to do it again. But before it seemingly was supposed to make impact, the light abruptly turned upward and shot straight up into the air. Now, Gorman attempted to pursue the object, but it was such a steep climb that his plane stalled out at 14,000 feet. He was able to restart it though and land it, so it's not like it's depicted in the show. He doesn't crash the plane or anything. But what makes this sighting so powerful is that there were numerous eyewitnesses to it. The two men manning the tower that night, Lloyd D. Jensen and H.E. Johnson, attested to the object's fast speed and maneuverability. And the Piper Cub plane, the pilot of it, Dr. A.E. Cannon, also saw the light and testified to basically the same thing. And here's a fun quote from Mr. Gorman. Quote, "I am convinced that there was definite thought behind its maneuvering. I am further convinced that the object was governed by the laws of inertia because its acceleration was rapid but not immediate. And although it was able to turn fairly tight at considerable speed, it still followed a natural curve." End quote. So this case was one of the landmark Project Sign cases. The other being the death of Thomas F. Mantell, and another account known as the Childs Whitted account, which involved two civilian pilots that witnessed basically a long cigar-shaped object fly alongside their plane at night. So that's really what that incident and what that episode was based on.
Sounds like movements that you would expect from a weather balloon, right?
Kind of. It kind of reminded me of, like, if you think about it, like maybe like an alien playing with a laser pointer. You know, it's got those hallmarks there. I like that.
Yeah. There you go. And we're just the cats following along, right?
Absolutely.
Well, something happened after this in the show was when Dr. Hynek used the term UFO for the first time. And I thought this was funny because when he used it, the Captain Quinn character, he kind of looks at him and is like, "Oh, what?" And then he goes on to explain, well, I'm kind of trying to coin this term to explain what we're investigating. Was he the one that actually coined the term UFO? And was it after that incident?
No, actually, the person that coined the term is is one of the people that coin is based on. Edward Ruppelt. He actually coined the term in early '52. He was looking for a different term because flying saucer had such a negative connotation associated with it. So he wanted a fresh term to go in with, and unidentified flying object is what he came up with.
I guess it makes sense too, because it's not. You mentioned earlier, a cigar-shaped craft. They're not always saucer-shaped.
No.
Now, in episode 2 of the show, Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn go to investigate a case in West Virginia where a mother and her children see something strange. And this is the case, according to the show, called the Flatwoods Monster, because it's not a flying saucer this time, or a UFO, use that term, but it's also involving a creature of some sort. Maybe an alien creature? Well, that's what Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn are there to find out. Ultimately, Dr. Hynek once again gives a rational explanation for the strange things that we're seeing. He stands up in front of the town and gives this speech. Captain Quinn and Dr. Hynek explain that the spaceship they saw was just a meteor. The creature that they saw was a great horned owl. And Dr. Hynek goes on to give a scientific explanation about hot air and cold air causing light to refract in different directions. It's why stars twinkle and mirages are formed in the desert, according to his explanation. And it's also how you can see an owl in a burning forest and think it's a monster. So that's how the movie, or I'm sorry, not movie, the TV show sets up the Flatwood Monster case. Was that a real investigation? And how well did the show do explaining those events that happened?
The Flatwoods Monster case was a real case that took place in September of 1952. And it really is almost something out of a horror movie, especially when you look online at the images that were created once the eyewitnesses described what they were seeing. So, a group of kids, Eddie and Fred May and Tommy Hayer, witnessed this fireball in the sky in September of 1952, and they saw it go down in the forest. So they gathered a small group that included the May's mother and Gene Lemon, who was a 17-year-old National Guard member. And Lemon led the charge into the forest, and they at first see what they believe is just two lights, but the more that they stare at them, the more that they realize that they look more like eyes. And then they see this large, metallic looking creature that had a, they described it like a spade behind its head, but it was completely red. And apparently everyone in this group, which consisted of seven people, witnessed this creature. Um, the town was kind of on edge a little bit, but not as bad as they depict it in the show. But Project Blue Book really didn't play much of a part in this case. This was really more investigated by civilian UFO groups and independent investigators. One of the most prominent was an investigator named Gray Barker, who uh, investigated a number of cases, including the famed Mothman flap in West Virginia in 1966 and 1967. But basically, all Project Blue Book did was looked at the uh, sighting of the object in the sky and just basically determined that it was a meteor. Um, but they didn't seem to acknowledge the creature at all in their files. So yeah, they didn't really play much of a part. But I did enjoy the depiction of the way that they did things. The skeptics have pointed to an owl in a tree as being the culprit of this, but I don't necessarily buy that.
but it's just the hot air and the cold air and
Well, the cool thing is when Hynek's talking about how stars twinkle, he was the astronomer that discovered how stars twinkle. So
oh,
it's
okay.
kind of fitting for him, you know?
Yeah, well that's cool. I didn't realize that I'm sure they pulled that in as as a little nugget there for somebody to find. That's cool.
Well, the cool thing about this show is that his children, Paul, and I think another one of his children, actually consult for the show. So it's a lot more. It has its dramatic elements, but it's pretty accurate as best as they have been able to contribute. There are some mannerisms that Aidan Gillen will do that apparently are the same ones that Dr. Hynek would do, and they've actually used like uh, personal items that J. Allen Hynek and Mimi Hynek had for the characters in the show. So it's a cool nod, and the show is very respectful of his legacy. So I appreciate it for that because he is this really monumental figure in UFO research.
Well, let's continue on because there's more episodes that we need to cover. After the Flatwoods monster case, we see that Dr. Hynek he's taking his role very seriously, and he's really trying his best to come up with some scientific rationale behind both the Fuller incident and the Flatwoods monster. But then the next case is the Lubbock Lights, and that's when things start to change as far as the show is concerned. And this is episode number 3 in the series. And it's the first time that both Captain Quinn and Dr. Hynek experience something themselves. They're out in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. Captain Quinn is inside the car, and Dr. Hynek is outside of the car when the car just starts going crazy. Lights are flashing, the radio's tuning frequencies, the entire car is shaking. And then a massive V-shaped craft with blue lights fly over, and they both see it. Now, in the show, General Harding and General Valentine in the military give Quinn and Hynek the explanation that what they saw was a top-secret experimental craft that has a V-shaped wing. And they show some photos that look like they could be real from that time period. But despite this explanation, Dr. Hynek doesn't believe that this is true, doesn't really believe what the military is telling him. And so he's starting to get the sense that perhaps he's not getting the full story. And at the very end of episode 3, we see him writing in his notebook, and he writes, "Possible government cover-up." So was the series correct in showing that Dr. Hynek started to have experiences of his own that he couldn't explain around the time of the Lubbock Lights? And did he start to suspect that he wasn't being fed the full story from the Air Force?
Hynek, as far as I know, never witnessed a UFO while investigating any cases during Project Blue Book. There's a really great biography of him called The Close Encounters Man by Mark O'Connell. And in it, he talks about a sighting that he may have had while looking through a telescope. He claimed he saw like a strange object fly over the face of the moon or something like that. But he never had an overt UFO experience during his time. Uh, in regards to what the Air Force was letting him in on, Hynek was one of the people that was on the inside, so they never really kept anything from him. If anything, he knew things that he couldn't really talk about. And in 1953, there was a CIA-led panel called the Robertson Panel, which basically came in, and the reason why they came in will it'll be coming up later in the line of questioning, and then it pertains to an episode like the last episode in the season. But they came in, they assessed the work of Project Blue Book, and they basically determined that, like Project Grudge, they had to now downplay reports in order to keep the public calm. So, in order to prevent mass hysteria, they were going to have to misidentify things, and essentially, Project Blue Book from 1953 onwards became Project Grudge all over again. But Hynek was there. He was doing the best that he could. He couldn't really come forward and say what he wanted, or he would be losing access to the Project Blue Book files, which at the time were the best place to get UFO files from. There weren't civilian organizations as of yet. They would pop up not long after, but um, essentially in 53, that was a turning point for Hynek, where he started to change from this total skeptic there to debunk reports to, okay, now I'm being told that I can't do my job properly. I don't like this, so I don't really trust the CIA at this point. And he would essentially go through this metamorphosis over time where he would become a believer in the phenomenon. So the way that they kind of depict it in the show, his turn doesn't happen that quickly, but it does happen over time.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like they, again, we see this a lot in movies and TV shows where they simplified it. It sounds like they just gave him an experience instead of trying to explain the CIA panel and all of these other aspects, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Lubbock Lights photographs are real photographs. I do believe the ones that they show in the actual episode are the real Lubbock Light photographs. And that case took place in early 51. That was during the transitionary period from when Ruppelt was coming in. But that was a case that stumped a lot of people. There were scientists that studied it, and the individual that actually took the photographs, he was a student, I do believe, at one of the universities. Uh, they took these photographs over a couple different nights, but they essentially show a group of lights in an arrow type shape in passing over the skies of Lubbock, Texas. It's a really fascinating case, and go look up those photos online. They're fun.
Yeah, and in the show, don't they kind of pass it off as possibly a flock of birds or something like that reflecting off lights? Was that a an excuse or a natural reason that was kind of thrown around there as one of the possibilities?
Yeah, that was an actual reason that investigators pinned. And they did end up doing a test and taking photographs. And what happened was you could see one speck of light from one bird. There wasn't enough reflection to actually pick it up. So it's not clear exactly what the Lubbock lights were. They actually traveled quite fast. Uh, they determined when they flew over them that they were traveling at somewhere near 1,800 miles an hour. So pretty sure birds can't do that.
Not any birds that I've come across. I hope not. At least that would be it's a fast flying bird.
That is a fast flying bird.
Well, the next episode, episode number 4, brings in Operation Paperclip, and this is when we're introduced to Werner von Braun. He is a former Nazi who built the V-2 rocket, and post World War II, he's heading up America's space program. So Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn get a first-hand look at von Braun's work, as they think that maybe one of the UFOs that they're investigating is just one of his rockets, and it's a top-secret rocket. So during this, on the show, von Braun pulls Dr. Hynek aside and offers him a job to work with him. But Dr. Hynek doesn't trust the former Nazi. I wonder why. But then, regardless, von Braun tells Dr. Hynek that he can't explain the sightings. He knows about them, but he can't explain them. And then at the end of the episode, we see von Braun overseeing a test with an American pilot being forced into a giant flying saucer. And as the saucer starts to take off, there's some massive rings rotating around it. Obviously, we have some effects going on there. And then, just poof, it just disappears. And von Braun simply says, it worked. Like, he's not, the show is implying that he's working on a lot more than just rockets. Can you give us an overview of Operation Paperclip, and did Project Blue Book cross with Paperclip and take Dr. Hynek to meet up with Werner von Braun?
So, for Operation Paperclip, basically, as World War II was winding down, American, British, and Russian forces were racing to scour Germany for military resources, technological advances, and anything that they could get their hands on that the Germans may have created. The Germans at the time were known for really high technological advances, especially in rocketry. And the Allies actually discovered a list called the Ozenberg list that contained the names of every single scientist that had worked for the Third Reich. Funny enough, they found it in a toilet, so take that for what you will.
Okay.
The Allies essentially tracked down 1,600 scientists and brought them to America. The OSS expunged their records. So they were basically given a clean slate, asked to work for the government. And the most infamous individual was Werner von Braun. And he is basically the father of modern rocketry. He designed the V 2 rocket, and he was instrumental for us in the space race. He pretty much got us to the moon. So um, I gotta say, Dan, I didn't really expect to find anything because I didn't think that Hynek had done anything with V 2 rockets or had met Werner von Braun. But you brought out the best of me, Dan. So I gotta thank you for that. Now I discovered this blog post on, I think it was Ohio MUFON's website, and let me tell you, this website looks like it's from the 90s. I love it.
Nice.
And it was written by J. Allen Hynek's secretary, a woman named Jenny Zeidman. And apparently, Hynek worked on V 2 rockets while at White Sands Missile Range after the war. Now, he had allegedly met Werner von Braun at that time, but nobody has ever come forward with this information. Like, it's not even in his biography, and even Hynek's closest friends do not know anything about this. So yeah, apparently he may have worked on V 2 rockets at one point. So yeah, that's new information to me, man. So good job
Wow.
on that.
Wow. Yeah. No. I mean, they're two high-profile characters. I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with von Braun, but he's kind of the face of the U.S. after the war, getting a lot of Nazi scientists to work on American technology. And for me, he was always kind of the face of that. So when I saw them together on the show, I knew that was something I had to ask. Like, did they actually meet each other? Is this just a show having two names that people might recognize and using it as an excuse to put those two together?
Right. Yeah. And apparently they did cross paths at one point.
Well, speaking of crossing paths with names, I'm going to ask you another one here, because in the show, there's one point where Dr. Hynek tells Captain Quinn, as you know, he doesn't trust von Braun, and he's like, you know, how do you make a Nazi look legitimate? You have Walt Disney give him his own special and beam him right into your living room. And we see this happen on the show. Did von Braun and Walt Disney actually team up for a TV special?
Oh yeah, a number of times. The first time was on an episode of what they called Disneyland back at that time. Today you would know it as the Wonderful World of Disney. And he appeared on screen to talk about plans for the American government to go to the moon. So he would also appear in a number of Disney specials after that. So Werner von Braun was the face early on for the space race. So yeah, he definitely did team up with Walt Disney a time or two.
Wow, that's fascinating. Wow. Okay, so moving on to the next episode. This is episode number 5, and it's entitled Foo Fighters. And in this episode, we see that Lieutenant Fuller from the very first episode, he's back, and this time he's in a group of people who have experienced something similar to him, you know, lights in the sky. Maybe not the exact same thing as him, but they're all similar experiences. And Captain Quinn explains the title of the show. He explains that during World War II, pilots would see lights that they couldn't explain, and they called them Foo Fighters. That's why they named the episode that. But in the episode, Lieutenant Fuller and his group of experiencers show Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn the lights themselves. They bring out this contraption that they've built, and they seem to be able to call the lights to them. But Dr. Hynek is quick to dismiss these as just car truck headlights bouncing off the fog in the distance. They're not really calling them to them. And then at the end of the episode, Dr. Hynek runs across Fuller at a secret hospital in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that's now abandoned. And Dr. Hynek shows Fuller something, and almost immediately, Fuller douses himself in gasoline and sets himself on fire. Now, after this, the show cuts to General Harding and General Valentine. They're very stereotypical secret government. They're just kind of sitting around this table in, very dark lit room, and just kind of what you would expect for a secret military government, I guess. But they talk about how somebody or something must have flipped Fuller's off switch, whatever that means. It doesn't really explain a lot right there. It just says, oh, it must have flipped him off, which sounds like something else. But that's but in the show there, it said it flipped the off switch. Now, when I was watching this episode, it was one of the first episodes that I was thinking, maybe this really wasn't based on something real. After all, the episode itself was claiming that Foo Fighters was a term used in World War II, and this is after World War II. And so I just assumed that maybe this was the show stretching things, and I got the implication just watching the show that Dr. Hynek probably never actually investigated Foo Fighters because those were during World War II, and this is supposed to be happening after World War II. Or am I wrong there? Did he actually investigate Foo Fighters like we see in the show?
He did not investigate Foo Fighters. He was really busy working on the proximity fuse by that time. But Foo Fighters were a real phenomenon during the war, and it was experienced by both Allied pilots and Axis pilots, and they both believed that this was technology from both sides being thrown at planes. But that's kind of confusing because, clearly it's not. None of them, claimed responsibility for it. And if we're talking about the Germans would totally take responsibility for that back in the day. There's no way that they wouldn't. But yeah, the Hynek never investigated the Foo Fighters. There wasn't really a lot of resources to investigate the Foo Fighters at the time. There was a brief investigation done by American forces, but they couldn't come to any definitive conclusion. But Dr. Hynek, he was working on that proximity fuse, which I do believe Time magazine ranked it as the third best innovation to come from the Second World War.
What is the proximity fuse?
Basically, it's a fuse that sends out radio waves. And when the radio waves bounce off something and come back, and that signal gets shorter and shorter, the bomb basically explodes. And realistically, you see that same technology in noise cancellation headphones now.
Well, we have Dr. Hynek to thank for that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious though, because in the show, when we see Lieutenant Fuller, his off switch flipped or whatever happens there, and it's a very tragic death that he sets himself on fire. But if his experience was based on a pilot named Gorman, I believe you said, was that essentially what happened to Gorman?
No, there's not a lot known about Gorman, but he seemingly lived a normal life after the Gorman dogfight. He served in the forces for a little bit longer and then went off and did his own thing.
Okay, well, the next investigation in the show covers green fireballs. They're sighted over a nuclear testing ground, and Project Blue Book is called in to verify that these are in fact meteors, a perfectly natural explanation. But something happens during the investigation, and Dr. Hynek sees the fireballs in the sky himself, and they are very clearly not meteors. Now, with another super secretive character on screen, a man that is simply cast, I had to look him up afterwards, just to see if he had an actual name, but they just call him The Fixer. He shows up, and Dr. Hynek theorizes out loud that perhaps the green fireballs are some sort of craft monitoring our nuclear testing sites, because that's where they were seen. Can you give us an overview of the the real event that this episode was based on and what Dr. Hynek's reaction was to it?
Sure. In November of 1948, reports started to trickle in out in the west of the phenomenon known as green fireballs. They were at first quickly dismissed as green military flares, but on the night of December 5th, 1948, two separate plane crews, one military and one civilian, in New Mexico, each attested to seeing a green fireball while in the air. Each of them described the object resembling a green meteor, but ruled out meteors when the object basically abruptly turned up and then leveled off, which I've never heard of a meteor doing. But those fancy meteors, they just do what they want these days.
Well, you've never heard of birds that fly that fast either. So,
No.
I mean,
So, 3 days after that sighting, on the 8th, two Air Force Office of Special Investigations pilots witnessed similar phenomena while they were in the air, and they described it as resembling a military flare, but it was too big and it was a lot brighter. And then 4 days after that, a man by the name of Dr. Lincoln LaPaz, he was an astronomer with the University of New Mexico, had his own sighting of the green fireballs. A lot of people were seeing them in and around military bases in New Mexico, mostly. And he basically was able to triangulate their position over Los Alamos National Laboratory. And in a letter to the Air Force, he stated that it could not be a meteor because it was traveling too slow at the time and it didn't have a tail coming off of it. So those sightings would continue from November of 1948 until April of 1949. And most of them were centered in New Mexico. Now, Dr. La Paz was tasked by the government to study the phenomenon, so it wasn't carried out by this would have been uh, Project Grudge at this point. It went from Project Sign to Project Grudge. But the military was growing concerned that this was a foreign weapon, which would make sense for them. It seems weapon like. So a lot of their top secret projects were also conducted in New Mexico. So it makes sense that they would be interested in it. And there were also similar objects sighted over nuclear storage areas in Fort Hood, Texas. So Dr. La Paz determined that whatever these objects were, they were not natural. They were not natural. Most of the sightings were centered, really in Los Alamos National Laboratory, and many of the staff there he interviewed, and many of them claimed to see these green fireballs. Now, the sightings would become more sporadic after April of 49, but they still continued on to the point where in December of 1950, the government decided to set up an instrument observation station at Holloman Air Force Base, and it was only manned by two officers, but they classified this project as Project Twinkle. So La Paz, had other ideas. He felt like this deserved a more rigorous study, and ultimately, when the government was done in 1950, they would downplay the sightings in their final report, but the sightings still continued on after that for a little while. Every witness that saw them claimed that it could not have been a natural phenomenon, which is, rare because you're talking about trained observers, scientists, and the such. Oh, another fun fact about Dr. La Paz, he had an earlier UFO sighting in 1947, and it was in Roswell, New Mexico. So he may have witnessed the actual Roswell craft crash, maybe. I don't know. But that's just an interesting little tidbit there. But Hynek, we're not really sure of what Hynek thought about these. We've never gotten any comments from him about it, and the investigation wasn't carried out by Project Sign or Grudge. It was something that the government was trying to keep under wraps. So, not really sure what happened and what Hynek thought there.
do we know if there were many other um, cases like that that were outside of Project Sign or Grudge or Blue Book? I guess I'm assuming that those projects were the kind of the official government investigation, and it sounds like this one was kind of an off the books, not really. I mean, official, but not really official, if that makes sense. In that way, to kind of not throw it in with all the others. Were there a lot of other cases like that we know of?
Not really. There isn't a lot of declassified information that I've ever come across that really points to additional government studies. Though Hynek later in his career, after really Project Blue Book was shuttered, he would make these comments that he was like the public face of like the UFO investigations, but he always made it seem like there was something else going on behind the scenes that the public didn't know. So there's a possibility that there are projects that we don't even know about.
Of course. Well, moving on to the next episode, we're up to episode number 7, and we come across the first hoax in the series. And according to the show, it's with a Boy Scout troop leader who claims to see a UFO and even claims to shoot at it and hit the alien that comes out of the craft. And for some time, the scoutmaster disappears, but then he staggers back into town just as Dr. Hynek is explaining that the lights that they saw were caused by swamp gas. Before long, though, Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn are able to figure out that the town's sheriff sent a telegram to Hollywood about having proof about the flying saucer story. And that happened before the Scoutmaster came back into town with that proof. So it would seem that the sheriff and the Scoutmaster were in on this, trying to make a bunch of money on what clearly was a hoax, trying to sell the movie rights. Did this hoax really happen the way that we see in the show?
Oh man, this is one of my all-time favorite cases. This is a really fun one. This is the case of a Florida Scoutmaster by the name of Sonny DeVergers. On August 19th, 1952, DeVergers was driving a group of Boy Scouts home when he saw a bright light flash over it's a trail called Military Trail near West Palm Beach, Florida. He thought it could have been a stranded motorist or a plane that had gone down, so he pulled over onto the shoulder and basically went in to investigate. He told the three boys that he was driving home to remain in the car, and he basically took a machete and a flashlight with him, and he instructed the boys to run to the farmhouse that was nearby if he didn't come back in 15 minutes. So from the car, the boys claimed that they could see like a ring of lights descending into a grove of trees. And they could also see Diverger's flashlight as well. And when they saw that his flashlight had gone out, the boys ran to the farmhouse. And soon an officer arrived on scene and they were about to commence a search. And it had been an hour or so, but Divergers emerged from the palmettos and was frantically waving his machete in the air and just like raving like a madman. But according to his testimony, he had been searching for about 4 minutes when he started to smell this nauseating odor. He also said that he felt like he was being watched, and he next claimed to feel this really intense heat that was coming down from above him. And when he looked up, he could not see the stars above him. There was this object that was just hovering over him, and it was he described it as a dull black object in the shape of a saucer, approximately 30 feet in diameter. Divergers moved back from the object, and when he did, he claimed to hear this metallic scraping sound. And when he looked up again, there was this hatch that was opened on the side of the object. He noticed a red light coming from the inside it, and it soon developed into a mist that engulfed his body. And the Vergers lost consciousness not long after that, and he woke up a short time later, and he was propped up against a tree, but he couldn't really remember propping himself up against a tree. And his eyes were apparently so burned that he couldn't see out of them. But Divergers underwent questioning with the local police, and they had noticed that the hairs on his arms were actually singed. So they also went back to the area of where it occurred, and they discovered burnt patches of grass on the ground. Now, when Project Blue Book was notified, Edward Ruppelt went to investigate. He took samples and then had them tested. They found that the soil had only been burnt at the top, so whatever had happened to them, it wasn't some kind of natural rot from underneath it or anything like that. Um, but Ruppelt would come to call this entire case a hoax, and in fact, he would call Divergers the best hoaxer that he had ever seen. Uh, he was painted as media hungry and also an opportunist willing to sell his story, but problem was is that they were never able to explain how he did it. They were never able to explain the burnt patches of grass, or like they couldn't explain anything that this guy did. They just hoax.
Oh wow. Okay. So even after the investigation, they're just like, we're not going to even bother to try to figure out exactly what happened here. Just assume that he's hoaxing it, huh?
It those kind of cases, and they were very rare at the time. Like Diverger's case is something very extreme. It's on the level of like a Flatwoods Monster kind of incident. And the government didn't really want to get involved with cases like that. And you would see from time to time that if they were reported, they would downplay them almost immediately. So, yeah, the government really didn't want to talk about weird cases like that.
I'm curious though, because one of the things that we see in the show, I mentioned it very briefly, but is when Dr. Hynek, when he's explaining the lights, he uses that says it was caused by swamp gas, and that's I have to ask about that because it's something that I'm familiar with from the movie Men in Black, of course, because they use that as an explanation of oh, it's swamp gas. That's pretty much the explanation for UFOs. And so I think it's something that's kind of caught on in popular culture as a common explanation for UFOs. Was that really an explanation that started with Project Blue Book?
It mostly started with Hynek. One of the most infamous investigations that he did occurred in Michigan in 1966 in the Dexter Hillsdale area. For approximately a week, sightings had been taking place in that area. It began on March 14th of 66. The police in Washtenaw County first witnessed strange lights in the sky over Lima Township, and they chased these lights for a period of time, but they were outmaneuvered every single time they tried. And throughout the week, people in Washtenaw County reported seeing similar objects in the sky. Some went on to report them as resembling like a spinning top, but the culmination of these sightings occurred 2 nights later that week. On March 20th, Frank Manor of Dexter Township reportedly saw a strange object in the swamp behind his home. He described it resembling a pyramid with a porthole on it from which this bluish green light was emitting. And then the next night at nearby Hillsdale College, over 80 female students witnessed a strange light rising and falling in a swamp near their dorm. Hynek was sent to investigate that case and was basically forced to conduct a rushed investigation. He didn't have a lot of time and was forced to give a press conference. One of the witnesses in that case had mentioned that at first, because they ended up witnessing what the girls did at the college dorm room in Hillsdale, believed it to be at first swamp gas, which is a real phenomenon. Basically, what happens in a swamp is when vegetation is dying, it will release methane into the air, and sometimes you'll basically see like a short flash of light that it creates. So Hynek basically was forced to say that what happened in Dexter Hillsdale was swamp gas, and he was ridiculed heavily for it. And in fact, it was his determination on that case that really shuttered Project Blue Book toward the end, because what happened was uh, I believe he was governor at the time, Gerald Ford. He was not happy with the determination that Hynek came to, and basically ordered for a panel, an independent panel of people to investigate UFO sightings. And this led to the Condon Committee, a group of scientists out of the University of Colorado that studied UFOs for a couple of years and ultimately determined that UFOs were not a threat to national security. In fact, they couldn't determine what they were at all. And that was the end of Project Blue Book. So the swamp gas thing is essentially Dr. Hynek's probably most fumbling move during his time at Project Blue Book.
Going back to the TV show, the next investigation that we see, when I was watching this, it really started to turn the entire series a little more sinister in my mind. It gave the idea that the military is trying to cover up some psychological tests that they're doing on their own soldiers. We see a group of Army soldiers who got a UFO attack on the platoon on film, and we're watching this. Dr. Hynek is watching this, and the military is watching this, and that's kind of what kicks off the investigation. But then in the end, we find out that these soldiers were shell-shocked from experiences in World War II. And at the end of the episode, there's a scene where the two generals, Harding and Valentine, are upset that the Secretary of Defense has been testing chemical weapons on their own soldiers. How much of that actually happened?
This incident is based on testimony from a private first class named Francis P. Wall. During the Korean War, this is like one of the most harrowing tales that you will ever hear. And there's some really messed up stories from soldiers during war about UFOs and such. And Wall was stationed near Chorwan, which was roughly 60 miles from Seoul, and his regiment was prepared to bombard a nearby village with artillery. And right before the attack was set to take place, this UFO appeared in the sky right above the village, and they just started firing off artillery burst after artillery burst, and there were shells that exploded right next to this object, but it didn't seem to take a hit. And at the time, the object was emitting an orange light, and it just was hovering over the village. That's when Wall basically asked his commander for permission to fire at this thing. And when permission was granted, everybody opened fire. The object changed to a blue-green color, and it started to make these eerie arcs in the sky. And then it started to shoot beams at these people. They all reported feeling a burning and tingling sensation as the beams of light were shown at them, and were all forced into underground bunkers at the time. They had to take refuge from whatever this thing was. Most of the men were trucked out by ambulance. They were actually too weak to walk. And doctors, once they got back to a hospital, noted how all of their white blood cell counts were really high. So they never explained what happened to these men. Some have pointed to like a Soviet weapons test, but even that's kind of out of the realm of possibility, even for me. As far as we know, it wasn't a government chemical weapons test, but I wouldn't put it past the government to have done that at any point in history. Like the government has done some shady stuff in the past. If you want a good example of that, there's a book that came out last year. It's called Poisoner in Chief, and it's all about one scientist's work during a project called MK Ultra. He was basically tasked with seeing what if they could use LSD to basically as a form of mind control. It's a very dark project for the government. So I really wouldn't put it past it at any point for the government to have done tests like that. There was the Tuskegee experiment, which I really don't want to get into because it was some pretty sick stuff. But yeah, I really wouldn't put it past the government to have done tests like that at some point.
Wow. Wow. Well, let's get back to the show then instead of getting even darker. But yeah, so in episode 9, Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn come across their first abduction case. And this is the case of someone named Thomas Mann, who claims that he was abducted by aliens. And there's a few key things from that episode of the show that I want to get your insight on. First is during this episode is when we see Dr. Hynek hypnotize Thomas to help him remember more about the abduction experience. Now, through hypnosis, Thomas is able to remember things that he couldn't remember otherwise. When I saw this, it hit me that this is similar to what we talked about when we covered the movie Communion, when you were a guest on the show to talk about Whitley Strieber's experience there. And I wasn't sure if Dr. Hynek kind of started that idea. When I was watching Project Blue Book, I got the idea that nobody was really familiar with using hypnosis in that way when he's using this on Thomas Mann. So was Dr. Hynek using hypnosis in his investigations, and was he one of the first to do that for abductees?
So this episode is loosely based on the Betty and Barney Hill incident, which is an incident that we recently covered on a two-part episode. And essentially, this New Hampshire couple reported having a close encounter with a strange object within the White Mountains. At one point, Barney had this dramatic sighting in a field of this object through a pair of binoculars. He claimed to have telepathic communication with the occupants of this UFO. And they also claimed to have suffered from missing time during this encounter, too. There was a period of time that they just couldn't account for. They started to conduct their own investigation almost immediately after coming home. And they read books voraciously, talked to experts, from scientists to UFO investigators, until they ultimately decided that they wanted to explore their experiences through hypnosis. And they ultimately found this individual named Dr. Benjamin Simon. He was a Boston based hypnotherapist. And through their work with him, uncovered an abduction narrative that involved the Hills being taken on board a UFO, subjected to medical tests, and then returned to their car. Now, Dr. Benjamin Simon was a pretty heavy hitter when it came to hypnosis. He set up a hospital on, I believe it was Long Island, to treat soldiers coming home from the war, from World War II, with all sorts of mental problems, basically treating soldiers with PTSD before PTSD was known as anything. And he would use hypnosis to do that. Um, Dr. Simon was the first to hypnotize an abduction witness. Hynek didn't really do that. He did advocate for it in a couple of cases, but he was not a trained hypnotist in any way. The probably the most infamous person to start doing this within the UFO community was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Leo Sprinkle, and he used hypnosis on a number of witnesses. And then later on in the 80s, a man by the name of Dr. or not Dr., just Bud Hopkins, he was a New York based artist. He kind of put abduction cases on the map in the 80s by conducting hypnosis sessions and working with experiencers. So, yeah, Dr. Hynek never practiced hypnosis in any way.
Now, something else I want to ask you about with that episode was when we see Dr. Hynek talk about a scale that he's been working on. He calls it Close Encounter of the First Kind, Close Encounter of the Second Kind. That's what happened to Thomas, their abduction, and then Close Encounter of the Third Kind being even beyond that. And that's a term that I think we're familiar with, if from nothing else, the movie. Was that a scale that Dr. Hynek invented?
Yeah, Dr. Hynek did invent that scale. It's what we call as the Hynek scale these days. There were actually 6 classifications. The first was a nocturnal light, which is basically your mundane sighting of a UFO at night. And then there is what he called the daylight disc, which is a sighting of an object during the day from more than 1,000 feet away. Then there is a radar visual sighting, which is primarily, witnessed by civilians and military pilots. It's basically when a pilot sees something and it's confirmed by radar data. And then we get to the heavy hitters. Close Encounter of the First Kind is a sighting of an object from approximately 1,000 feet away or less. Close Encounter of the Second Kind is a sighting where an object leaves a physical trace of some kind. So, in the Florida Scoutmaster case, there was the burnt grass. And even in the Betty and Barney Hill case, there was really strange readings that they got from their car. On the back trunk, they noticed these circles about a $50 size that they don't know where it came from, and they ended up testing the trunk with a compass, and they found that it was magnetized. So that was a physical trace case. And then the Close Encounter of the Third Kind is when an object is seen and an occupant of that object is seen. So some kind of humanoid being is seen at the same time. And the interesting thing about the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind is that when Steven Spielberg was working on that and he wanted to use that title, he actually had to go through J. Allen Hynek because that was his copyrighted title. So J. Allen Hynek ended up consulting on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he even has a cameo at the end.
Oh, nice, nice. I'll
Yeah.
have to watch that again and look for him. I don't remember. Of course, I don't know that I would be able to pick him out without finding a photo, but
Here's the hint that I'll give you. Look for the man with the healthy Van Dyke. You will notice him.
okay. Nice. Okay, well, at the very end of episode 9 in the TV show, Dr. Hynek he's given a head up by that mysterious fixer guy that something's going to happen in Washington, D.C. So he flies there just in time to see a show of lights over D.C. Now, in the show, this happens in the middle of the day, and then later, Defense Secretary Fairchild, he was the one who was doing the chemical testing on the soldiers that we saw in an earlier episode. He's killed as his car bursts into flame just before he's about to reveal the truth to the world. And then, meanwhile, we see that lights come back, and military scrambles some F-94s to respond, but they have trouble keeping up with the objects as they're flying around Washington, D.C. And at the very end of the episode, which is the end of the season, Dr. Hynek tells Captain Quinn that he's come to the realization that the only way they'll be able to find the truth is to keep the jobs that give them access to information in more cases, but to convince the government that they don't believe, because that's clearly what the higher-ups want. They're given this cover-up. So we get the sense that Dr. Hynek is pretty much just going to play the game and keep trying to find the truth. So how well did the TV show explain the lights over Washington, D.C., and what happened to Dr. Hynek and Project Blue Book after this?
So 1952 was a big year for UFO sightings in the United States. 3 incidents covered in the first season of the show happened in 1952. The Flatwoods Monster case, the Florida Scoutmaster case, and the most significant of them, which was a pair of incidents that came to be known as the Washington merry-go-round, as Edward Ruppelt would call it. Um, in July of that year, and over the course of 2 weekends, objects were seen by numerous eyewitnesses over and kind of outside Washington, D.C. The first major incident took place on July 21st, just outside the city. Pilots and radar personnel reported objects nearby. A pilot by the name of Casey Pierman of Flight 807 described the object resembling a falling star without a tail on it. And then on the 28th, objects were sighted again over Washington, D.C. This time, the Air Force scrambled jets to chase them down, but the objects outmaneuvered them very easily. And Ruppelt was summoned at the time by President Harry S. Truman for an explanation, but Ruppelt hadn't been able to conduct an investigation at that point, and he didn't have answers for them. So ultimately, they rushed to call a press conference and quickly quelled all the excitement. The government blamed it on weather. Yep, that's right, weather. Um, but it's basically because of this incident that the Robertson panel, which I mentioned previously, led by the CIA, was convened and then ultimately decided that UFO reports had to be downplayed. Edward Ruppelt would leave a Project Blue Book by the end of 1953 because of it, and he ended up retiring. He wrote the first uh, really landmark book about his time on Project Sign and Project Blue Book. It was called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. He actually died very young, at the age of, I believe, 37 of a heart attack. So, yeah, it's. I think they did a good job of playing up the hysteria aspect the government was generally operating under. The nature of cover-ups when it comes to this phenomenon and when it comes to UFO history, it's this question of, you're tackling this question of whether they downplayed reports to keep the public calm or because the government was hiding something that they had. And it's never really ever been cleared up, but I've always leaned towards the government was just trying to keep the public calm. I don't think the government really has any uh, definitive information about this stuff, but you never know. I could be wrong. The government could come out and say, we got aliens hanging out at Area 51. I don't know. You never know.
You never know. Yeah. Well, in that episode, which is episode 10, when we see in the show, his name is Secretary Fairchild, the defense secretary. When he dies of very suspicious circumstances, that led me to think that maybe it was based on somebody that might have died in similar circumstances, that they showed that so plainly there. Was that based on something that actually happened?
Secretary Fairchild is based on the first Secretary of Defense, James V. Forrestal. Forrestal died in 1949, well before the Washington merry-go-round, but he died under very mysterious circumstances. He was receiving treatment at the Bethesda Military Hospital in Maryland for a mental breakdown, and his body was found having fallen from a great height from his hospital room. It's unclear if he committed suicide or if he was actually just thrown from the window. But his death has been lumped into conspiracies involving a group that most likely didn't investigate UFOs, but was an actual group within the government, and they were called Majestic 12. Most point to Majestic 12 as a group that essentially were studying the effects of radiation after bomb tests, but many have lumped them into this government conspiracy where they were essentially trying to keep the proof of extraterrestrial life from the public. And many believe that Forrestal was killed because he wanted to come forward and tell the public about extraterrestrial life being real and having visited us. So, uh, kind of darker, a little darker in the real sense of what happened to Forrestal here.
One thing that we didn't get to cover that I just want to ask you about real quick is a storyline that goes throughout the entire show, and that's the character of Susie Miller. And in the show, while Dr. Hynek is off on his investigations, it cuts back to home life with Mimi, his wife, a lot. And we get this sense that the character of Susie is a Russian spy of some sort. We hear her speaking in Russian over the radio to someone with her quote unquote husband, which we know is not really her husband. We get the feeling that's not really her husband, but that's what she introduces him as. And we get the overall idea that they're probably Russian spies trying to infiltrate Project Blue Book through Dr. Hynek's wife. Was there any truth to that side of the whole show?
Not really. There was no real uh, indications that the Russians were trying to infiltrate Project Blue Book. But interestingly enough, Annie Jacobson, who wrote a book about Area 51, has this theory that the Roswell crash was a Russian craft designed to basically cause mass hysteria. And what she points to is that her source claims that uh, Joseph Stalin really got a kick out of the Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast. So he said her theory is that he essentially wanted to cause mass hysteria in that kind of way. Of course, it didn't pan out that way. Roswell was a case that was shuttered for over 30 years before anybody really started to know that anything had crashed in Roswell, New Mexico. So, yeah, not really. There was no real attempt by the Russians to infiltrate this program.
Interesting. I never heard of that possible theory about Stalin there.
It's a wild one, man. It's a wild one.
Nice. Well, is there anything from the show that, as you were watching this first season, that you just wish that they had put in there?
Listen, Hynek needs a Van Dyke. Somebody get a Van Dyke on Aidan Gillen. We need it.
There you go. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about Project Blue Book. I know we didn't cover season 2 that much on this episode, as we're recording this. The season's still ongoing, but you'll have to come back on once that season is over and chat about whatever the events are that we see there.
Oh, absolutely, man. I'd love to.
In the meantime, if you're listening to this, Rob has an awesome podcast that covers a lot of UFO-related events and history. Go open up the app that you're listening to this on and subscribe to Rob's podcast called Our Strange Skies. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of your podcast and some of the great stories that you cover over there?
Sure. So, for a long time, I had the impetus to cover singular UFO stories, and I'd seen that nobody really did it. And a lot of podcasters just kept coming to me for like content. They just were like, hey, what's a good UFO case to cover? And I'm like, I'd usually give them something, but I'm like, why don't I just make a podcast of my own? So I created the Our Strange Skies podcast, and we've been through a couple of transformations. But right now, what we do is we devote singular episodes, or if some require multi-part episodes, to UFO stories throughout history from the United States. We've covered stories from Brazil and a few other places, but we just covered the Betty and Barney Hill incident, the Lonnie Zabora incident, which is another famous New Mexico UFO sighting. We covered the first abduction case, which occurred in 1957 in Brazil, and there's a lot of great episodes over there. So yeah, if you want to know more about UFOs, come on over to the Our Strange Skies podcast. We got plenty for you.
Awesome. And you started a new show recently too, right?
Yes, it's called The Coda, a music podcast, and every other week I'm joined by my buddy Brian Hasty of the Double Density podcast, and we discuss music news, and we generally have a main feature, a main topic where we discuss something from music. We've talked about our favorite opening tracks to an album. We've talked about our best albums of 2019, and we recently had a couple of guests on to talk about a new album that they dropped. So if you're interested in music talk, check out the Coda, a music podcast.
Awesome. Thanks again so much for your time, Rob.
Well, thank you.
We have a lot more to go, but I do want to point out that even though Rob was talking about his podcast, Our Strange Skies, that's not actively in production. Remember, that chat with Rob was in 2020. You might still be able to find it online, though, if you want to go through the archives. If it is available, I'll be sure to add a link to it in the show notes so you can check there. Before we move on to season 2 of Project Blue Book, let's find out the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game for season 1. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1. Project Blue Book was the first time the government investigated UFOs. Number 2. Former Nazi Wernher von Braun teamed up with Walt Disney to promote the U.S. space program after World War II. Number 3. The term Foo Fighters was used by World War II pilots who saw unexplained phenomena. Did you figure out which one is a lie? I've got the answer in the envelope, so let's open that up. And the lie is number 1. While Project Blue Book is typically the most popular investigation the U.S. government had into UFOs, as we learned from Rob, it was actually a follow-up to Project Sign and Project Grudge. So even though there were a lot of the same people involved in these different government projects, Project Blue Book was not the first time the U.S. government investigated UFOs, or what people these days call UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, instead of unidentified flying objects. Okay, now let's set up another game of Two Truths and a Lie for Season 2 of Project Blue Book. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1. In the 1950s, the U.S. government illegally experimented with LSD on unwitting U.S. citizens. Number 2. The phrase "little green men" comes from a close encounter in Kentucky. Number 3. Project Blue Book was commissioned by JFK. All right, I'll be back after the Season 2 discussion with Rob to see if you got it right. And now, here is the remastered version of my 2020 chat with Rob Kristoffersen about Season 2 of Project Blue Book. All right, well, then let's dive into the second season. In the first episode of the second season, we're introduced to the Roswell incident. If there's one name that just about everyone knows that's connected to UFOs, it's Roswell. But that doesn't mean everyone knows the details of what happened there. According to the show, on July 5th, 1947, there was a major storm around Roswell, New Mexico. And then the next morning, a rancher by the name of Mike Connors found a field covered in strange metal. By the end of the day, his neighbors were collecting pieces of the debris, and he wasn't really convinced that it was man-made, so he contacted authorities. They swooped in, but someone leaked the story out. It hit the wire, and then it started to run worldwide. Newspapers in Europe even ran with the story. The show doesn't really say how the authorities shut the story down, but it does say that once Harding got involved, 2 days later, Connors bought himself a brand new car, and the town stopped talking. So I'm going to assume that they were paid off. The wreckage was flown to Texas, where Harding held a press conference explaining the saucer was nothing more than a weather balloon. Now, I know we could have an entire episode, an entire podcast just dedicated to the Roswell incident, but in a nutshell, how well did the show do depicting the events of the Roswell incident?
Well, with this particular episode, the bare bones are there. Some details have been changed, but the storm in question that starts the episode occurred on the night of July 2nd, 1947. And the man in question, they call him Mike Connors in the show. Well, his real name was Mac Brazel. And on that night, Brazel claimed to hear a strange sound that didn't quite sound like thunder and lightning. So he was the foreman of a sheep ranch owned by a man named J.B. Foster. And the next morning when he woke up to get started, he discovered a debris field outside. It was about 3/4 of a mile long by about, I think, like 20 feet wide or so. So this was a really remote area. The closest town to the Foster Ranch is a town called Corona, which is about 30 miles away. But he showed the debris to his closest neighbors, which were Floyd and Loretta Proctor, who owned the ranch themselves. And they tried to cut it, they tried to burn it, but they were not successful in doing so. So the Proctors urged Mac Brazel to report the debris to the authorities, and Brazel ultimately did 4 days later. It's not exactly clear why he waited as long as he did. It could have been a combination of the July 4th holiday and the hesitation on Brazel's part to do anything with it. But on Monday, July 7th, he brought the debris to the Chaves County Sheriff Department, who in turn notified the Roswell Army Airfield, which is known today as the Walker Air Force Base. The base dispatched 2 officers, Major Jesse Marcel Sr. and Captain Sheridan Cavett, to actually retrieve the material. Brazel escorted them to the ranch, and they actually ended up spending the night there before they headed back into town. They gathered up as much as they could, and they also tried to cut it. They tried to burn it. They also tried to hit it with a sledgehammer, and they found that they couldn't make a dent with it. So it wasn't until long after they brought it back that the military swarmed the place. And before Jesse Marcel Jr. or Jesse Marcel Sr., sorry, actually brought it to the airfield, he brought it home where his son, Jesse Marcel Jr., and a few of his other family members claim to have actually seen the wreckage. Some of them, some of the pieces, Jesse Marcel Jr. claimed had these like weird hieroglyphic writings on them that were in like this purple kind of script. But he said that it was more closely resembling metal. It's kind of one of those things that gets debated a lot, but the military just swarmed the place, and they actually sent out a lot of this wreckage. It was ultimately going to be flown to Wright Field, which later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is where Project Blue Book was stationed out of. But in the meantime, while they were collecting all this stuff, the military decided to send out a press release. And the man that made that decision was a man named Colonel William Blanchard, and he informed the base's information officer, Lieutenant Walter Hott, to send a press release into town. And like Hott physically brought these press releases to like the Roswell Daily Record and a few other places in town, which seemed kind of odd for the times, considering that they could just send it, via wire. But that's like one of the weird parts about this case, one of the tiny weird things. But it ends up making the paper the day, like later that day, saying, Roswell Army Airfield recovers flying saucer. So yeah, while this was all happening, Major Jesse Marcel Jr. He made a stop at Carswell Field in Denton, Texas, as he was accompanying this wreckage to Wright Field. And a gentleman by the name of Roger Ramey, who was a general, he had Jesse Marcel Sr. pose with pictures of what they were claiming was a down weather balloon. And ultimately, the next day, they would retract their initial headline saying that they recovered a flying saucer and saying, no, it was all just a weather balloon. Now, Jesse Marcel Sr. attested to the fact that it wasn't the same stuff. He was saying that they kind of made up this mock weather balloon, had him pose with it, but it was not the actual wreckage that made its way to Wright Field. And he went to his grave saying the same thing. Same with Jesse Marcel Sr. What's interesting about this case is after it was retracted in 47, people in the UFO community, by and large, forgot about this case for about 30 years. Wasn't until 1978 when independent researcher named Stanton Friedman was actually told while he was conducting a radio interview that he should talk to Jesse Marcel Sr. And from there, Roswell has become this big household name when it comes to UFOs and not trusting the government because the government has changed their mind as to what was recovered on multiple occasions. And it's just this big cultural touchstone now.
Wow. So I've seen the picture of him kind of, I'm assuming Marcel on the front page of the paper, he's got holding something in his hands. That would then be what they kind of staged as the weather balloon, not necessarily the material that was actually recovered.
Right. Yeah. That's what both Jesse Marcels claimed, is that it was not the same stuff. It was swapped out. They were trying to keep this thing, on the down low, covered up. And that's really why Roswell is as big a thing as it is, because given that the Air Force has changed their mind as to what it was on multiple occasions now, nobody really trusts their explanation. So you have a ton of explanations out there now. There's a book called Area 51. It was written by a woman named Annie Jacobson. And she proposed at one point through one of her sources that what the Roswell wreckage was a Russian craft that had been sent over into American territory to cause hysteria, because apparently Joseph Stalin was a big fan of George Orwell's, or sorry, not George Orwell's,
Orson Welles,
Orson Welles, the
War of the
War
Worlds.
of the Worlds broadcast. Apparently, he was a huge fan, according to her source, and that this was a mock thing dreamed up by the Russian government. That's probably like the low end of believability on this, but there are a lot of interesting theories when it comes to Roswell.
I don't remember if it was in episode 1, but I do remember the show actually mentioning that very, very briefly. I think that the two generals are talking to each other, and one of them talks about how the things that Dr. Mengele did to those children, and and the saucer was Soviet propaganda or whatever. Like, they just kind of imply that that's what it was Soviet, and then of course Dr. Mengele, the Nazi doctor, doing something to the bodies to kind of make them look like aliens or whatever. I just remember that very, very briefly in the TV show. So it sounds like maybe that's where that comes from.
There are, other theories like that out there. There's some that get really, really dark, but it seems like everybody has a theory on Roswell these days.
Well, heading back to the show, in episode number 2, it's the part 2 of the Roswell incident. And during this episode, we find out about a resident in town named Duncan Booker. And he crashes a massive UFO into the center of town to try to draw attention to what he says is the real story. General Harding agrees to go on TV with Booker to tell the world that this was nothing more than a hoax. But once they go live, Booker's friend at the TV station starts playing footage of an alien autopsy. And then Dr. Hynek comes to the rescue, and he realizes that, oh, look, the studio lighting in the footage is the same. This footage is a hoax. But then Booker insists that they recreated the footage, but it was actually from something that they actually saw. Now, I thought I remembered something about some alien autopsy footage that showed up quite some time ago, but I don't remember if it was supposed to be from Roswell or related to that or not. Is that real footage, and was it tied to the Roswell incident like the show implies?
So the alien autopsy video was huge. It was a real video that came out in the mid 90s. During that time, that's where UFOs were kind of hitting their cultural boom. This was when Roswell had really blown up in popular culture, and it was actually all thanks to Unsolved Mysteries. Unsolved Mysteries was the first show to really give that case its due. So by this time, aliens and UFOs are big, and they're appearing on a lot more television shows. And one of the networks that really ran with it was Fox in the 90s, and they ran a program in 1995 called Alien Autopsy: Fact or Fiction. And it was hosted by Jonathan Frakes of Star Trek: The Next Generation fame, and a man by the name of Ray Santilli came forward saying that he found footage of an alien autopsy. And he had, at the time, been looking through a retired military cameraman's footage, searching for actually footage of Elvis for like some documentary. And he claims that he stumbled upon this autopsy of an alien being that he says was one of the bodies at Roswell. So the Fox airs this special, and it is huge, so much so that they re-air it a couple months later, and it kind of just dies down for about a decade, when in 2006 Ray Santilli claimed that the footage was a recreation of footage that he had seen in 1992. It had degraded so bad that he couldn't actually save it. So instead, he has this convoluted explanation that in fact he actually reshot the footage, recreated everything in order to bolster his claims. But it's it definitely didn't help his case. But in 2018, a filmmaker named Spiro Smalaris revealed that he was actually the creator of the film, and he claimed that he created the alien sculpture using foam and stuffing the insides with basically animal parts. So um, this video footage kind of keeps like reappearing every now and then. There was a leaked government document about I want to say maybe late last year, in which two guys, one of them was a high-ranking military member. The other had been a consultant with the government, saying that this footage was real, but nobody at this point buys that it's actually real.
Well, it sounds like the show is taking that concept, but this is happening in the, well, I mean, Roswell being in 47, but then, this happening after the fact in the 50s and stuff like that as far as the TV show timeline, it kind of bounces back and forth. But none of that, it sounds like if it surfaced in the 90s, it sounds like they're taking something from decades later and kind of throwing that in there just to add to the narrative.
Yeah, pretty much. There's always been like UFO hoaxes. They've always been prevalent. The first UFO hoax goes back to 1947 in these kids, and I forget exactly what town they lived in. I think that it was called Woodworth, and they ended up this is when Kenneth Arnold had his famous sighting. It was shortly after that, and sometime in July, and these kids mocked up this UFO and they put it on this one lady's lawn. And the reason that they put it on that one lady's lawn is because she was known as the town gossip, and they knew that word would get around really quickly. And to the point where the National Guard actually ended up coming to town and these kids got in trouble. So, I mean, there's always been hoaxers and there's always been people trying to make a buck. And I mean, Ray Santilli probably made a killing selling videotapes. So,
well, I wanted to ask you about something that the show has when they're investigating on the show, Hynek and Quinn, they come across a soldier who was at Roswell, and the soldier's name is Stuart Terry. He tells them that there wasn't just one crash site, but there was a second one. And at that second site, Terry talks about how he shot something. Later, he recovered the remains, buried on his land, and then Hynek and Quinn go to where it was buried, and they find some skeletal remains. But then I think there was a mention as well where someone mentions how the authorities asked for 5 child-sized coffins. So maybe there was more than just the one being that we see shown on the actual TV show. But what about this concept of 2 crash sites at Roswell? Were there actually 2 crash sites with multiple beings supposedly found?
There have been a few different narratives concerning, the crash saucers at Roswell. One being that the craft in question was hit by lightning over the Foster Ranch and it created this debris field, and that the actual saucer crashed 150 miles away in a place called the Plains of St. Augustine in the late 70s, early 80s. As Stanton Friedman was researching this case, he learned of a story through a secondhand and third-hand sources. A lot of people came forward saying that this guy named Barney Barnett discovered the crash saucer and alien bodies at this place called the Plains of St. Augustine. And Friedman was never actually able to talk to him directly. He had died about a decade before he started researching it, but a lot of people came forward. I want to say like maybe 5 or 6 people came forward and said, oh yeah, Barney Barnett, he told me the story about how he saw these alien beings in this crash saucer all the way at this site. And there was also allegedly an archaeology class that had walked up upon it at the same time that he did. Now, there's also speculation that what had happened was that there were 2 saucers that crashed, and one ended up at the Plains of St. Augustine, and the other allegedly crashed 2 to 3 miles away from the Foster Ranch. But nobody's ever really been able to pin it down to one. And again, that's what makes Roswell this narrative that has been built on over and over again upon time. The child-sized coffin portion of this comes from a man named Glenn Dennis. He was a part-time assistant at the local funeral home, the Ballard Funeral Home, and he claims to have received a call from the Army Air Force inquiring about the availability of child-sized coffins. He claims to have delivered 3 or 4 of them to the base, and He also claimed to have ran into a nurse on the base who had witnessed the alien bodies and even drew a sketch of them on a napkin, of which Dennis actually recreated. I don't think there are photos. If you Google Glenn Dennis, alien sketch, you'll come upon like this. There's like 4 small images on what looks like a piece of like white stationery. I think he ended up recreating it, but his testimony has been called into question simply by the fact that they've never been able to confirm who this nurse was at the Roswell Army Airfield. So yeah, these are this just attests to the reason why Roswell is this like ambiguous mound of testimony at this point.
Well, moving right along, we're in episode number 3 now, and Project Blue Book has a case at Area 51. It involves 2 soldiers, Willingham and Miller, and they were doing a routine patrol when Miller was abducted by a UFO. When Hynek and Quinn get to the site of where it happened, you can see the sand there was turned to glass. Other than Roswell, of course, everyone knows about Area 51 and how it relates to UFOs and top secret cover-ups and things like that. But was Dr. Hynek ever there to investigate an abduction like we see in the show?
Abductions were something that Project Blue Book tried to distance themselves from, and we really didn't get our first abduction account until 1961, when Betty and Barney Hill had their experience, which we briefly talked about in episode 153. It was the inspiration for one of those episodes, and they tried to explain away certain portions of their sighting. So, for instance, the only parts that they investigated were the sighting of the actual craft in the sky, which they claimed was, I believe, like an advertising searchlight or an advertising like plane or something like that, flying at like midnight or whatever, which was a really ridiculous explanation.
It's a great time to advertise.
Yeah. It's a great time. Let's advertise to the single folk, the single couple that are just driving on the highway.
They call that targeted advertising. That's that one.
Yeah, absolutely. But the only abduction investigated through like the guise of Project Blue Book was the abduction of a police officer named Herbert Shermer in 1967. And it wasn't exactly investigated by Project Blue Book personnel, but by an independent body that had been brought in to study the phenomenon called the Condon Committee. And this committee arose in 1966 after a series of sightings in Michigan, to which Dr. Hynek probably made the biggest, what many would consider career suicide at that point, by labeling a UFO sighting as the product of swamp gas, which is where that term came from. These sightings occurred in the Dexter Hillsdale region of Michigan, but this Shermer's case is kind of fascinating because he's a police officer with the Ashland, Nebraska Police Department. He was fluent in multiple language. He was a very intelligent man, and on December 3rd, 1967, he was on a routine patrol. He was on a rural road when he saw a light, which he assumed to be a vehicle having trouble. And when he drove up on it, it was a UFO. And he stopped his car, and in the next moment, he appeared to be missing time. But through the Condon Committee, he was subjected to hypnosis. It was later revealed that he had been taken on board this UFO, been shown around by some really interesting looking aliens, and he was ultimately returned. But this case caused such an uproar to the point where Shermer was driving to Colorado, the University of Colorado, where this project was being handled. And during one trip, a group of people actually ended up destroying his car for no real reason. I still don't understand it to this day. It was it seemed to cause some kind of uproar, but Shermer ended up serving for a little while longer in Ashland, Nebraska, and then he ultimately moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he died in 2017. But there's actually a really cool graphic novel created about his sighting. It's called December 3rd, 1967, An Alien Encounter by a guy named Mike Jasorka. And Shermer claimed that he eventually read it before he died, and he claimed that he had come to see his sighting in kind of a religious sense. So that's really the only abduction case that Project Blue Book ever gave the light of day. Most of them really went unreported until the 80s, when more and more people started to come forward. Before then, you had scattered incidents. Most of them would be um, relegated to the UFO journals and such. But abductions just weren't something that Project Blue Book wanted to handle. And really, any incidents involving sightings of alien beings, they would downplay. They would only investigate certain portions of it, especially when it came to like the UFO sightings itself. But when it comes to animate beings, Project Blue Book said, no, we're out. We're done with this.
Well, it sounds like the TV show is almost doing something similar to what they did with the autopsy footage, where they're finding an excuse to, in this case, bring in Area 51, because everybody knows what Area 51 is. So we need to have a reason for Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn to be there to basically have Area 51 on the show, because it's a show about UFOs, and so you have to have Area 51, right?
Area 51 is just kind of the hot gossip around town. And it wasn't until a journalist named George Knapp, he started talking to a guy named Bob Lazar. And Bob Lazar, his credentials have never fully been proven, but that has not stopped him from speaking on the record many times, saying that he had worked briefly for the government. He had worked like maybe less than a month, 2 to 3 weeks or so, reverse engineering this UFO, which he affectionately called the sport model, which has always been kind of funny.
Oh, cool. They have like SUVs and the sport coupe versions and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I would assume so. Like there's got to be a caravan somewhere in there in Area 51, I would assume.
Of course, travel in style. I wanted to ask you about something with Area 51, because the show kind of gives the indication that there's more than just the base there. I think there's a scene where we see Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn. There's like this massive complex, massive doors opening in the side of a mountain, and Quinn says something to the effect of, what we saw back there at the base was just the cover. This is the real Area 51. Is there any evidence to suggest that the base that everyone knows is at Groom Lake is just a cover for some sort of massive hidden base nearby?
Bob Lazar claimed that he didn't exactly work at Area 51. He worked at a portion of Groom Lake nearby that they called S4. And S4 was supposedly this huge underground complex, went down for miles, and that's where they were storing all of these UFOs that had crashed and that the government was trying to reverse engineer. And they also housed apparently aliens that worked with the US government. And I mean, like, there are many places, many bases that people claim aliens work with the government on technology and stuff like that. So really, that extends from Bob Lazar and his claim to work at S4. And the interesting thing is that George Knapp, in the introduction to Bob Lazar's autobiography, which came out late last year, he claims that he called up Nellis Air Force Base and said, is there an S4 anywhere out there? And the guy's like, yeah, there is. So it's like, well, if George Knapp can call up and ask if there's an S4 out there, why can't anybody do it? Like, come on.
I was going to say, is that all it took? Somebody just picking up the phone and making a call? That's all.
It seems to be. That seems to be it. Like, all you need is a phone and, some liquid courage, and they'll tell you that S4 does exist.
If we head back into the TV show, episode number 4 covers an event in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. According to the show, Jimmy J. Shoemaker is in the woods near his house when he sees a UFO fly over. And at the house, his entire family sees creatures in the woods. We can see a shot where his family's all lined up with rifles and they're shooting through the walls of the house at the creatures outside. Shoemaker tells Hynek and Quinn when they get there that aliens landed there and tried to kill them all. And then later we find that Shoemaker happens to run a circus. He has monkeys. He has costumes for them and a green glaze to make look like alien handprints on the trees we saw. So Project Blue Book determines that this was all a hoax, even though, again, we have the same sort of theme. Shoemaker is claiming that he was just recreating the things that actually happened. It's similar to what we saw with Duncan Booker in the Alien Autopsy a couple episodes earlier. So how well did the show do depicting this event in Hopkinsville?
The Kelly Hopkinsville incident is one of the most fascinating UFO related incidents since the 50s. It's kind of one of those cultural touchstones to the point where it inspired a character, a Pokemon. So I mean, it's one of those cases that it perks up a lot of people's ears. So they got there's the bare bones there. It occurred in the hamlet of Kelly in Kentucky on August 21st, 1955, and it occurred on the farmstead of the Sutton family. At 7 p.m. that evening, a friend of the family, the guy's real name was Billy Ray Taylor, claimed to see a UFO with this colorful exhaust. It passed over him. It hovered near some trees nearby, and it came down. And this was as he was going outside to collect some water. Now, these folks, they did not have electricity. They didn't have running water. They had an outhouse. This is rural life to the fullest. So Billy Ray, he comes inside and he tells everybody, "Oh, I saw this UFO. It came down. It's out back." And nobody believed him. But an hour later, he and his friend, the one that he was there to visit, Lucky Sutton, he lived in the house. They went outside when their dogs just started to bark uncontrollably. And at first they saw what they believed to be a strange glow coming from behind their property. And as it moved closer, they were able to make out small humanoid creatures about 3.5 feet tall. They claimed that its head was it was oversized, it was round, and it had really large ears, which was one of the more curious features of this creature because you don't often see ears reported on aliens, but in this case we do. And their arms were almost as long as its entire body. They hung really low, and its hands had talons on them, of all things. So this thing is scary as hell. They had eyes that glowed a pale yellow color, and the two men immediately went inside, grabbed firearms, and pointed it toward this creature that was coming toward them. And this creature had its hands raised as if it's saying, "Don't shoot at me." But they fired anyway. This creature did a flip. It fled under the cover of darkness and disappeared. Now, mind you, there are 11 people living on this farmstead at this time. And it's really in a small 3-room shack. So you have 8 adults and 3 children, and many of them saw creatures appearing at the window after this. So it was about maybe a half hour to 45 minutes later that one of these creatures appeared at the window. They fired again. And again, this creature just flipped and fled into the trees. So it fully escalated after Billy Ray Taylor stepped out the front door and had his hair pulled by one of the creatures who had climbed up on top of the roof. So the family, they all packed inside their house. They holed up for a few hours, listening to the footsteps on the roof until they eventually fled to their cars and drove to the police station. Now, the officer that accompanied them back, he claimed that these are not the kind of people that would go to the police to solve their problems. So they were really scared. They were shook up. And they accompanied them back to their house, but all they found were some spent shell casings. There were holes in the screen windows. But after the police left, the creatures actually came back. It was at approximately 2:30 a.m. The matriarch of the household, Miss Glennie Langford, saw one of the creatures near her bedside window, and it put a hand on the window screen. And I would be scarred for life if I saw that.
I mean, I've seen horror movies that start this way. This is
Yeah, exactly. This is a horror movie in the making. It's happening in real time. So it was about 5:30 when these creatures backed off and they were never seen again. And the family's ordeal made national news headlines. And because of the way this case was portrayed in the news, there were a lot of details that were blown out of proportion. Like a lot of papers said that there were like up to 11 of these aliens when the family claimed that they only saw 3 of them. But it's from this case that the term little green men is something that entered the vernacular, and it's something that kind of exists still today because if you look at many of the popular images of alien heads, they're usually green, and it's because of this case. According to documents, Project Blue Book never took an official interest in this case, though Hynek did later write about it in one of his books. But this is definitely I would say the real true to life case is a little more interesting than the way it was displayed in Project Blue Book. I think the problem that I have with Project Blue Book is there really isn't a lot of mystery left over when you start to explain everything away, and I think that's one of the fatal missteps of the second season is they just start to explain things more and more.
one thing they did mention in this episode was a program in the CIA called MK Ultra, and they're supposedly doing some work with precognition. Is there anything about MK Ultra? Like, was that an actual program?
Oh yeah, Project MK Ultra was a real project. It was a CIA funded study pertaining to mind control through the use of LSD and other psychological measures. MK Ultra is a whole other can of worms, and like you could probably do. I could go on forever talking about it, but I want to direct people to a few different resources because it is one of the more. It's one of the darkest kind of portions to the work the CIA has ever done. But our friends at the Not Alone podcast did a 3-part series back in 2019 on MK Ultra and just the extent that that project went to. There's another great podcast that just made a 5-part series on a Canadian physician's part in that program. It's called Madness, and it's from the podcast Endless Thread. That's a really great series. And one book I'll recommend too that just came out last year because more and more people are starting to take an interest in this case, and it's a lot of it has to do with the death of a man named Frank Olson, which was the subject of a Netflix series called Wormwood. But there's a book that came out last year called Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer, which is a really fascinating book. So yeah, if you really want to see like the dark end of some of the CIA's research, go check out those things.
Well, we'll leave those for there off the show. We head back to the TV show, and episode number 5 happens at a place called Maury Island. And according to the show, it happened on June 21st, 1947, 2 weeks before the Roswell incident, a fisherman by the name of Ernest Reed, was out on Puget Sound checking his traps. After about an hour, something appeared overhead. He described it as round. There's a silver craft with holes in the middle, and there were bigger than his boat. There were multiples of them. We see kind of a recreation of it on the show, and they're hovering less than 100 feet over his boat, but there's no noise. And then something seemed to go wrong. Reed couldn't tell if one of the ships was breaking apart or if it was trying to bomb him on purpose, but there's pieces falling all over, hitting his boat. And that's when he called in a mayday claiming that he was under attack from alien ships. But then, soon after the event, Reed recanted his story and said he was just trying to get some insurance money for fire damage on his boat. And then the show says that this was the first time that quote-unquote men in black hats were reported when they showed up to silence the town. How much of that happened, and was this the first time that anyone saw the men in black?
So this is the Maury Island incident is one of the more controversial UFO cases. But as the story goes, the gentleman's name was Harold Dahl. He was recovering logs in the Puget Sound on June 21st, 1947. That's when he noticed 6 donut-shaped objects that were heading in his direction. And one of the objects appeared to struggle maintaining altitude. It dropped to about 1,500 feet, and it floated directly over Dahl's boat, and it started to drop what he claimed was slag-like metal down into the sound, and some of it ended up hitting his boat. The debris ended up hitting his son Charles, breaking his arm, and some of the slag actually killed their dog too. Dahl claimed to take a photo of the craft, though it's never surfaced. Nobody's ever seen this thing, so that's sketchy as hell. But he showed it to his supervisor, which was a man named Fred Chrisman. Chrisman didn't believe him, though, and he went to investigate it for himself and claimed to have seen a UFO while he was out there investigating. So the next morning, a man wearing a black suit showed up at Dahl's house and escorted him to a diner. And he proceeded to recount Dahl's experience the day before as proof that he knew all about his experience. So Dahl was told by this man, don't ever speak of it. Don't ever tell anybody, otherwise bad things are going to happen to you. So eventually, Dahl ended up telling his story to a lot of people, but he eventually recanted his story. But it was investigated by 2 people, Kenneth Arnold, who I previously mentioned. He was kind of the first independent UFO investigator, and I think people looked to him just because he had a sighting. And he was accompanied by another man named Captain E.J. Smith, who had witnessed a UFO while piloting a passenger plane sometime in July. They didn't believe Dahl or Chrisman, though the alleged debris that they had, I believe it was Kenneth Arnold had talked to a couple of Army intelligence officers who ended up coming down. They were going to escort some of this debris back to have it analyzed. And shortly after takeoff, their plane actually did go down in the Pacific Northwest. And there's been a lot of conspiracies that have come up because of that. But the reason this story and the Men in Black angle itself was popularized was because of a book written by a man named Gray Barker called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. The book featured the Maury Island case and a handful of others in which individuals had contact with shady men wearing black suits telling UFO witnesses not to talk about what they saw. And I think the interesting thing here is that after Dahl kind of talked about his experience, his work, which was on the Puget Sound, kind of started to dry up, and his son went missing for a period of 2 weeks and was discovered working in a diner in Montana, and he had no clue how he got there. And we know that portion of the story is true because there was an FBI file uh, opened on it. So there are some elements of the story which are true, but I think they're used to fuel um, like the more sensational aspects of this case, because I do believe at one point uh, Harold Dahl's wife also attempted to stab him um, because of all of the controversy revolving around the case. She kind of just wanted him to cut it out, but yeah, almost stabbed him. But this is like one of the more controversial cases in that not a lot has been proven. And if I recall correctly, Fred Crispin was actually one of the people subpoenaed by the Warren Commission when they were investigating the assassination of JFK, and he has had ties to the military and I think maybe the CIA, but don't quote me on that exactly. But yeah, it's a kind of a whole can of worms. The Maury Island incident.
Speaking of can of worms, I want to ask you about something else about the Men in Black, because during this episode, we learn more about someone from season 1, and in that season, he was simply known as the Fixer. In this episode in particular, we find out that his name is William, and he used to be part of a remote viewing program for the CIA, but then he left that program and joined a group simply known as the Men in Black. The idea that I got from the show was that the Men in Black isn't a part of the CIA or the military, but they still seem to have powerful resources. And after I watched the show, this episode, and kind of how they explained it, I still really wasn't sure if William left the CIA to start the Men in Black on his own, or if he just joined a already existing group somehow. I'm sure Men in Black can be, again, an entire series by itself, but how well do you think the show did just explaining kind of the Men in Black themselves and who they're supposed to be?
There are a lot of different theories when it comes to the Men in Black. That's definitely one, that these are kind of government agents. Some believe that they are independent agents that work of their own accord. Some believe that they are actually aliens, as when during the Mothman series of sightings, which you've covered with our good friend Sam Fredrickson. People had encounters with Men in Black, and they would act as if they didn't know what random mundane items were, like pens. Like there was one case in which the main reporter of the town, her name was Mary Hyre. She was kind of the woman who led the charge on reporting the Mothman sightings in the paper, printing the reports, and she ended up having an encounter with this strange man who, when he came into her office, he started asking strange questions like, "What do you think John Keel would do if they told him to stop talking about the Mothman and stuff like that?" And at one point, he reached for a pen and he was holding it as if he didn't know what it was. And Mary Hyre said that he could have the pen. At which point, he turned around and laughed and ran out. So like the yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff around the Men in Black. There is even one theory that guy named Paul Cornell, who wrote this comic series called Saucer Country, and in it, his take on the Men in Black was that they were actually Air Force agents that would, as part of a hazing ritual, go and harass UFO witnesses that their reports ended up in the news. So they'd show up on their door, pretending to act like government agents and stuff like that. It's there's a lot of takes on the Men in Black, and they never cease to amaze me. There's another interesting account from this woman who claimed to be a remote viewer, who said at one point she was going to remote view the Men in Black. So like remote viewing is kind of like it's sending your like body or out into the world to like kind of like see things from a distance, So this woman claimed that these beings were extra dimensional beings from a different dimension. They kind of kept balance, making sure that evil aliens didn't interfere in human affairs, and they also had a ton of paperwork to do.
Well, it sounds like at least the show is going off one of those theories, even though there's a lot of them.
Yeah, there's so many angles that they had to work with on this, and they could go a million different places, and I'd say Project Blue Book went the more mundane route. Now, I had a conversation with my buddy Rich Haddam, the guy who wrote the screenplay for the Mothman Prophecies, and he said that when they were first pitching this idea for Project Blue Book, he actually went in and he was trying to pitch himself as the showrunner for Project Blue Book. He didn't get it, obviously, but it would have been fitting, seeing as how he's well versed in this stuff.
Speaking of the show, if we head back, we're in episode 6 now, and this is where we learn about the Robertson panel, as well as someone named David Dubrovsky. The storyline in the show suggests that there's a battle between control over UFO investigations between the U.S. Air Force and the CIA. The CIA puts the Air Force on trial with the Robertson panel, which looks into the validity of Project Blue Book's work. In the hearing, it seems no one is interested in really diving into the reports from Blue Book. They pretty much just skim them and then close them as if they already have the answer that they want, and this is just a formality. But that's when David Dubrovsky comes to the story. He convinces Hynek and Quinn to let him talk to the panel, where he says that he was directed to be there by beings from another planet Venusius, which is 2 galaxies beyond ours. And he leaves the room, and then Quinn says, "We're doing our part by stopping people like Dubrovsky from inciting panic around the nation, from people who might actually believe that they're telling the truth." How well did the show do depicting this? Did any of that happen?
So the Robertson panel was a real panel. It was led by the CIA, and that did in fact change Project Blue Book's mission from like an open-minded investigation to skeptical debunking. But it didn't really happen. It didn't really go down like this. The Robertson panel was led by the head of the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, and they saw the potential hysteria that these sightings could cause. Life magazine at the time was claiming that the evidence of alien life was like around the corner. They were, pretty. They believed that alien life was going to show up at any second. And in the last episode that I was on, there was a pair of dramatic sightings during 2 consecutive weeks over Washington, D.C. that I talked about that really got the government a little worried, to the point where the CIA felt like they needed to step in and kind of gauge Project Blue Book and dictate its mission. The number of UFO reports in 1952, right before the Robertson panel came in, went up dramatically. Most years after 1947, they would get like maybe 30 reports a year, 30 to 50. That year, they got over 130. So they saw this as a huge concern, and they thought it could be used as kind of like psychological warfare tactics. So they recommended educating the public on debunking sightings. And this isn't to say that Dubrovsky's character didn't exist in the UFO world, in the UFO culture. There were a number of people that were dubbed the contactees, who claimed to have contact with Venusian aliens who wanted mankind to basically get rid of its nuclear weapons to protect the environment. So yeah, it's didn't really go down the way it did on the show, but it's close. I mean, the Robertson panel's there, but as far as I know, there were no contactees that were led in front of the Robertson panel to testify at any one point.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you about that, because in the show, the Brovsky character, he is claiming that aliens directed him to go help prove the validity of Project Blue Book. But if aliens wanted to prove the validity, couldn't they just like show up to the hearings themselves? I think there was even a line in an earlier episode where Captain Quinn says something like, "Why are all these sightings happening way out in the woods? Couldn't they just come to like Times Square? Why do they have to be so cloak and dagger about everything?" Are there any examples of stories where the logic like that just kind of doesn't make sense?
So many contactees, especially in the 1950s, had stories like this, and they would also use that kind of similar logic. In fact, pretty much all of them did. Um, when it comes to these stories, like, they're never truly about going to the government with this information. It's usually about like proving the validity of their own sightings. But pretty much every single one of them, George Adamski, who was one of the most well-known contactees of the 1950s, basically, reported the same things. There was George Van Tassel, Orfeo Angelucci. Even during the Mothman stuff, Woodrow Derenberger was that type of individual. And despite the fact that Woodrow wasn't coming to the government to say, to cut it with the nuclear stuff, a lot of them did. A lot of them did, and a lot of them faked evidence to bolster their claims, and a lot of them made money doing it. So in the 50s, that seemed to be the contactee kind of thing. You know, make money claiming that you had contact with aliens, that they're peaceful, but they just want us to cut it with the nuclear crap.
Well, back in the show, we're at episode number 7 now, and it is the Curse of the Skinwalker. This case takes place at a ranch in Utah owned by the Chapman family. One night, their son Billy is sleepwalking outside when 3 orbs of light fly over, and then they fly into the ground, forming a creepy sort of shadow monster or something of some sort. The family runs away, of course, because that's creepy, and Blue Book is called to investigate. Our heroes are looking at the case. Hynek and Quinn are told the story of the Skinwalker. As the legend goes, the Ute Nation used to abduct Navajo and sell them on the New Mexico slave market. So the Navajo put a curse on them and the land, and that land happens to be where the Chapman's Ranch is now. Skinwalker is the name that the Navajo gave to a medicine man who is chosen to take the form of an animal in order to inflict pain and suffering on others. The explanation that the show gives for all of this is that the scientists at an Air Force base some 10 miles east of the Chapman Ranch are drilling down in the caverns under their ranch. They're using a high-powered water mixture into the fault line, and these release pockets of ethylene gas that can give people aural and visual hallucinations. So it's quite a connection from the Skinwalker to just being a hallucination. But was Blue Book involved in skinwalkers and this idea that they're just a hallucination, like the show indicates?
The basis for this episode is an actual ranch in the Ute Valley of Utah, and it's called Skinwalker Ranch. It was owned by a couple named Terry and Gwen Sherman, and they claim to have experienced rather large wolves, strange UFOs, portals, poltergeist-like phenomenon, and a variety of other phenomenon on their property. The Skinwalker has kind of become this concept appropriated from like Native American culture, and it's largely because of a book called Hunt for the Skinwalker, which was chronicled the Sherman's time on the ranch. It's safe to say that Project Blue Book never investigated this case and never really would have either. It wouldn't be in their wheelhouse at all. They were really more concerned with investigating like single sightings as opposed to like long-term areas and stuff like that. But yeah, in many ways, this episode seems like a plug for the new show that they had started that was airing after Project Blue Book, the season finale. It was called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. It's a Brandon Fugel show. it's definitely a moment to cash in. That sighting didn't come, the property didn't really come to the forefront until the mid 90s. And really, it didn't come to the public conscious until about 2006, 10 years later. It definitely seemed like more of a money grab. And Project Blue Book wouldn't be investigating a place like this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if we head back to the show, we're on episode number 8, and it introduces another concept that is familiar with UFOs, and that would be Hangar 18. Hynek and Quinn are told about it by a mechanical engineer named John. He explains that Hangar 18 looks more like a storage building than a hangar, but the real lab is 6 floors deep. That's where they reverse engineer Soviet technology. But this time, John says they have something that's not Soviet. The suggestion there being that it's extraterrestrial. So what is Hangar 18, and are there reports of reverse engineering UFOs there?
The idea of Hangar 18 is actually connected to the Roswell crash, and in particular to a few pilots who claim to have flown wreckage and alien bodies to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. One of them is a man named Oliver Henderson, who told his story to like a number of Roswell investigators. Claimed that he actually flew the child-sized coffins all the way to Wright-Patterson. And there's a World War II flying ace named Marion Black Mac Magruder, who also claimed to actually see living alien beings walking around in this fictional hangar. There is really no Hangar 18. It's just kind of been this myth that has been propagated ever since like the Roswell investigation. But I mean, it did inspire a Megadeth song, so that's got to be worth something.
It's got to be worth something, yeah. There you go. What about the idea that Hynek was there? Because we see in the show that Hynek actually gets there. Is there anything to suggest that Hynek himself was at any place like that?
No, there's nothing. It's Hynek was really close with his secretary, and he seemed to tell his secretary pretty much everything. There might have been some secrets that Hynek, kept to himself, but I don't think Hynek visited any kind of facility like that.
Well, back in the show, now we're at episode number 9, and this case is a Soviet bomber carrying a nuclear bomb that gets cut in two by a UFO over Canadian airspace. And Blue Book is called in because the Canadian Air Force doesn't have a UFO program. So Hynek and Quinn make their way to a small logging community at a place called Hartley Bay, way out in the middle of nowhere. They find the plane along with the 2 pilots that survived. One is just called Alex, but the other pilot is given a full name, Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Oblinsky. And that makes me think that maybe Alex is made up, but maybe Yuri is real. How much of this case really happened?
So the actual case that this episode is based on is it's honestly a little more terrifying than the one on this particular episode. So on the night of November 23rd, 1953, the U.S. Air Defense Command near the U.S.-Canadian border detected a blip on radar over restricted airspace above Lake Superior. The Air Force scrambled an F-89C Scorpion jet from Kinross Air Force Base, piloted by First Lieutenant Felix Moncla and Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson. And from the start, Robert Wilson had trouble tracking this thing once he got in the air, and it kept changing course like really quick. But with the aid of ground control, they were eventually able to kind of get a lock on this object. And they pursued it for over 30 minutes, getting closer and closer. Eventually, Moncla and Wilson were guided down from 25,000 feet to about 7,000 feet. They watched, the radar operators watched as one radar blip chased the other. And a short while later, they lost radio contact with Moncla and Wilson. And the witnesses there claimed to see on radar these 2 objects merge into one and fly off. Now, Moncla and Wilson have never been seen. again, nobody knows what happened to them. Wreckage from their plane has never been found. They just disappeared. And, there have been some like hoaxers coming forward. There was one in 2006. He claimed to be from a company called the Great Lakes Diving Company. They claimed that they walked up, they found something like, a plane in Lake Superior. It was ruled a hoax. But like, Moncla and Wilson have never been seen since. And if you look at Moncla's tombstone, his memorial, it explicitly states that he died while in pursuit of a UFO.
What about the idea in this episode we see Dr. Hynek actually neutralize an atomic bomb? Did he ever actually do anything like that?
Probably not. He was he had worked with rocketry, but I don't think he had worked with the atomic bomb specifically. And maybe in a situation he'd be able to know how to disarm it, but I don't know. What I love about this show is like they kind of treat JL and Hynek as if he's like a jack of all trades.
He's the hero of the show, so of course he's going to save the day no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, at the end of that episode 9, Dr. Hynek and Captain Quinn get to meet Senator John F. Kennedy when he stops by the Project Blue Book office. And the case from Kennedy takes place during Operation Mainbrace. This goes into episode number 10. There's a massive multinational military exercise that involves some 200 ships, 80,000 men. And if anything happens during a war exercise that size near Russian territory, it could spark World War III. So Hynek and Quinn investigate aboard USS Wisconsin in the North Atlantic near Norway. They find out that this UFO experience, that this sighting that's happened, it's not coming from the sky like all the others, but it's actually coming from underwater. But there's something else about this. There's a fishing trawler that was there. It left Shanghai some 11,000 miles away just 2 days ago, and the fuel tank is still almost full. Needless to say, that's impossible. And at the end of the episode, Quinn takes a mini sub underwater to where the flying crafts are coming from, but the Admiral orders depth charges dropped anyway, and the last we see of him is a massive explosion outside his sub. We assume he's dead, except Dr. Hynek believes maybe he's not. Maybe he was transported somehow like that boat from Shanghai. Did any of that happen?
Operation Mainbrace itself was a real operation. Like the sensational parts, definitely didn't happen. But Operation Mainbrace at the time was composed of dozens of NATO organizations that had sent ships to participate. At the time, it was the largest peacetime military exercise since World War II. And it was meant to simulate a mock attack on Europe. It involved 200 ships, 1,000 planes, and over 80,000 men. And during this exercise, UFOs were spotted. The first sighting came on September 13th, 1952. The crew of a Danish destroyer spotted a triangular-shaped object with blue lights on it, moving through the night sky at high rates of speed. 7 days later, aboard the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a reporter named Wallace Litwin claimed that several pilots and flight crew members saw a silver-colored sphere in the sky following behind the fleet. There is an actual photo of this object as well, though many have tried to debunk it as a weather balloon. It doesn't appear to be a weather balloon, and the only places that it could have been launched from have denied launching weather balloons around this time. It was also moving way too fast to be a weather balloon. An object had been seen the day before that sighting on September 19th as a British meteor jet was returning to an airfield after conducting exercises in the North Sea. And the pilot of that flight claimed to see a strange silver circular craft following the meteor. They described its movements as that of a falling leaf from a tree, which is a common thing reported in a lot of UFO sightings, is that some of these objects appear to be like doing this slow falling pattern at times. The object stopped in midair, rotated, and then took off fast away from everybody else. But yeah, main brace was a real exercise. They saw some UFOs. I don't know that Kennedy really played a part in it, but it is a pretty fascinating set of sightings.
Was Kennedy associated with Project Blue Book at all?
No, he was not. There have been theories that people have suggested, claiming that Kennedy knew alien secrets, that he had told them to Marilyn Monroe, and that's why the both of them were assassinated. But there's really no truth behind those statements at all. It's just conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I think the show kind of alludes that. There was I think at the end of episode number 8, there was a brief line of dialogue with Daniel Bakes and the CIA. He's talking to General Harding, saying, "When it comes to the CIA, no one is untouchable." Right? It kind of in my mind ties. Okay, it's something with the JFK assassination as a CIA plot, somehow tied to Blue Book.
Right, right. And that's the thing, and that's also like the ambiguity that the assassination of John F. Kennedy is kind of lended itself to. The Warren Commission really didn't do a good job explaining themselves and explaining everything that happened. But yeah, it's just, it seems like with some conspiracy theories, and the longer that they are around, the more they get added to, and the more people come out of the woodwork saying, well, this happened or that happened. It's always interesting to read them sometimes, but yeah, I don't put a lot of stock in them.
Well, that makes sense. I did want to ask about, I think it was in episode 3, there was a scene where we saw Hynek and Quinn in a Jeep, and a big UFO flies over, lights shine down, and then by the time the camera focuses on the Jeep again, Hynek and Quinn are gone, giving the impression that they were both abducted. Was Dr. Hynek ever abducted himself?
No, he was never abducted. He when he came to present his theories and stuff like that, he was very guarded. He was always very skeptical. He was never rash to point to one thing. He had his theories, and he had his leanings, but when it came to a case by case basis, he would never go there per se, and say, that this is true or that is true. And given that, Hynek even disputed the one UFO sighting that he claimed to have while looking through a telescope. So yeah, he's always been that skeptical kind of guy. But as far as I could tell, and through all the research, he has never been abducted.
Well, we have talked about a lot of different concepts and things that they put into the show, things like Area 51 and Skinwalker Ranch and these other elements. If you were in charge of this season of Project Blue Book, was there anything that you wish would have made it onto the show that they left out?
I think there are a lot of other interesting sightings that they could have really gone to, and like I say, with especially with the Skinwalker Ranch episode, you look at that and you see that it's just a kind of a walking advertisement for another show that's coming out. But uh, I'm glad that they included things like the Kelly Hopkinsville incident. If I could, trying to think, what would I have them include? I think the Herbert Shermer sighting is fascinating in the fact that we're talking about a police officer that claims to have been abducted by aliens. I think that would have been a more interesting case to present. In that means there's a case known as the RB-47 case, and it's kind of a the one case that many have put up as like the best scientific evidence for UFO, because it literally involved a UFO following a radar plane in the sky over like hundreds of miles. It's a pretty fascinating case. Um, Really, I think they did the best that they could with this season, but Yeah, I can't think of any other cases off the top of my head right now, but those two I think, would have made for interesting episodes.
Well, thank you so much for your time to come on to chat about Project Blue Book Season 2. I've learned a lot. It's been a fun chat.
Yeah, thank you again for having me on, Dan. It's been so fun.
And that brings us to an end of the 2 seasons of the History Channel's Project Blue Book. But stick around because we still have the chat with Project Blue Book's creator, David O'Leary, and showrunner, Sean Jablonski, to get another angle of the whole show. That's coming up right on the other side of our 2 Truths and a Lie game for Season 2. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 Truths and a Lie for Season 2 of Project Blue Book. Number 1. In the 1950s, the U.S. government illegally experimented with LSD on unwitting U.S. citizens. Number 2. The phrase little green men comes from a close encounter in Kentucky. Number 3. Project Blue Book was commissioned by JFK. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Again, I've got the answer in the envelope, so let's open that up. And the lie this time is number 3. As Rob pointed out, President Kennedy was not associated with Project Blue Book at all. There has been some speculation that maybe he knew about alien secrets, but there really hasn't been any proof of that. Okay, now I've got one more remastered episode for you today about Project Blue Book. Coming up soon will be my chat from 2021 with the creator of Project Blue Book, David O'Leary, along with the showrunner of Project Blue Book, Sean Jablonski. But first, let's set up one final game of 2 Truths and a Lie for that episode. Number 1. They wrote a Season 3 of Project Blue Book telling stories beyond the United States. Number 2. The Roswell incident was made famous by Project Blue Book. Number 3. David and Sean have both had unexplained experiences. Okay, now let's hear from David O'Leary and Sean Jablonski about creating Project Blue Book. UFO mentioned. Either they just won't believe what you say, or they'll simply watch it to find a way to tell you that you're wrong. I can only imagine how difficult that is when you layer that onto the normal difficulties of trying to pitch and create a show that's based on UFOs. So my first question is simply, why Project Blue Book? Why did you decide to create a show around UFOs when you could create a show that doesn't have nearly as much controversy surrounding it? David, as the creator, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure thing. And hey, everybody, and Dan, thanks for having us. Thanks for having us on. Yeah, I mean, listen, for me and for Sean as well, we like UFOs have been sort of a lifelong obsession, interest. I've always had a deep interest in this subject matter, going all the way back to when I was a kid. I'm not sure why, but I just was always, fascinated with the unknown, and it always rang true to me. I would watch, Unsolved Mysteries in the 1980s, or scare the crap out of myself and read Whitley Strieber's Communion when I was 9 or 10 years old. And it always felt authentic and true. So especially, some of the more famous cases. In terms of Blue Book, I as I became an adult and moved out to LA and pursued a career in writing and all that kind of stuff, I wanted, this was sort of right before end of 2017, and UFOs kind of really hit the news again. And there wasn't actually, frankly, a lot of UFO stuff on TV. X-Files had sort of come to its end. And I'd become a bit of a UFO history buff, and Project Blue Book always just felt like such an interesting, ripe sort of world for TV, in that it was period, it had all these other interesting elements in the 1950s in terms of the Cold War and the rise of the atomic age and all that kind of stuff. And then just a plethora of incredible cases. And then really just a focus on the characters who sort of led that effort, with Dr. J. Allen Hynek and Captain Ed Ruppelt, sort of the first director of Project Blue Book, both who basically shifted sides and became, adamant believers that there was something worthy of rigorous scientific study here. So I I think it began with that idea of could we tell a story, sort of historical drama through the lens of these characters? And I was fortunate that, like, I guess there wasn't a lot of UFO stuff at the time, and I think Project Blue Book presented a certain natural engine with sort of a kind of a different case every week, with a really interesting sort of backdrop of getting to kind of tell it in this sort of noir 1950s. Um, Sort of shadowy sort of way, and we were just very, very fortunate that, it took some time, but that eventually it found a home with A&E Studios and history.
How about you, Sean? How did you kind of get involved in this?
So I came a little later, once David had, sort of researched and written the script and had connected with Robert Zemeckis, and I think they had a series order by that point. I've been in the television business for, it's like 25 years plus at this point, I think. And so I've, every TV show needs to have a showrunner at some point, and David, as talented as he is, had not been in that position before. And so if you're going to start any business, you're generally going to want somebody who has that experience to sort of be in there and help guide the process and understand what's coming up in front of you and how to run a writer's room and just all of the things you're not going to know if you haven't done it. So I essentially interviewed for the job, which began with meeting with David at a diner. And we realized very quickly that, like him, I've kind of been obsessed with UFOs my whole life. It's been something that since I was a kid, I remember seeing one when I was 10 years old, I swear to God. And so it's just something I've always been fascinated with. So we were trading stories to the point where we stayed so long, I got a parking ticket. And then, of course, you've got to go through the gauntlet of meeting the studio and the producers and the network and all that stuff. And it just felt like such a very sort of natural match. And then we just sort of moved forward from there that, we really connected on having the same passion, in terms of that. But so I'm just happy to have had the opportunity to meet, someone who shares that, in terms of how I look at just even the phenomenon and want to tell those stories. I feel like, it's very much in vogue right now for people to be talking about UFOs in a very serious way. And I think, like any new science, and it is a bit of a science now because we're just starting to discover it, because we have sort of the minds that are being applied to it, and the science and the technology, and the credibility of the people who've come forward. But for people, to go back to your earlier point, for people who can, when you talk about, is there controversy around UFOs, or why stir that up, or when people say that, my first question is like, well, what do you know about UFOs? I would ask, like, what do you know about the history of UFOs? Because a lot of people want to throw it off as something, tinfoil hat wearing, silly. Like, if they were here, they'd be landing on the front lawn of the White House and blah, blah, blah. But when you really understand the history, and the amount of cases and the amount of credible people that have come forward, physical evidence, visual evidence, all of this, it is without a doubt something that exists. And I count myself as a true believer. And the second question I would ask somebody is, what do you believe about it? What do you have to believe that it doesn't exist? And oftentimes people will sort of stumble and go, well, I just think that this would happen if there would be this, the aliens would have said something by now. And then when you dig into that, you realize it's just sort of a belief people have that's sort of based on on a feeling, right? Which is just like, oh, I don't know, I just feel like it wouldn't happen this way, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, when you sort of dig into that, I would imagine the way people would have felt before, I don't know, we discovered bacteria when we didn't have a microscope. It's demons inside your body. That's what it's got to be. And then when the science caught up and we were able to see what was actually going on, there's still a bridge that has to happen where people have to get on board and understand that the facts that are there and the people that are studying it are not crazy. And then all of this stuff gets borne out. So I feel like that's a very important pursuit right now, especially in a world where truth is such a malleable concept. And so I love the idea that David and I, again, I think found a path and a passion towards wanting to get those ideas out there. That it's be part of that notion of getting the truth out to an audience.
What was your interest kind of starting with that? You said you had an experience at 10. Was that kind of when your interest in UFOs started?
100%. I was in New York City, which where I grew up, and saw lights in the sky moving, silently in formation. There were these long sort of hexagonal type lights, and I remember very clearly. I can still see it very clearly. The moment where you look up and you're like, "Am I seeing what I'm seeing? Could it be what I think it is? It has to be something like just this." You go through this whole range of emotions, and of course I was a kid, but I still remember it very clearly to this day. So yeah, I mean that's where it had to start for sure.
David, have you ever had an experience?
So I had something weird happen to me much later, and it was actually after I sold the show, but before the show got picked up to series. And I actually like didn't share it for a while, except with like my wife. And like basically I was walking home. It was a weird. I was walking home. I lived kind of near the Grove, for people who know Los Angeles. I was walking home through my neighborhood, and I was weirdly, I had to park a couple blocks away because of street parking, which was sort of a rare thing. And it was a quiet night. It was kind of late. And then the other strange thing was I was actually on the phone at the time, late, with a friend of mine, which was also kind of just not usual. But I'm so glad that I wasn't by myself, because I think I would have freaked out even more. And I saw what looked like a teardrop shaped, sort of self-luminescent, almost like a green kind of Chinese lantern, emerge from out of the trees, like 25, 30 feet above me. And I stopped, and I did exactly what Sean does and what so many UFO witnesses do, and sort of be like, is that a drone? What is that? I'm not hearing any like whirring. Then I don't know if this happened or not, but it felt like it stopped, and it was kind of flickering, and it sort of started to move towards me. And I panicked. And I ran. I'm on the phone with a friend of mine, and he's sort of laughing. He doesn't understand what's going on. I'm like, dude, I'm like, and I duck under it, and then it just sort of like continued on, kind of floating over the sort of like the area I lived in is sort of 2-story houses, so it's just like like 30, 40 feet in the air, just over the houses, and continued behind the some line of trees and stuff. Other than like talking to my wife about it, I didn't share it for like a year. Because I don't know, like I like didn't want to be the guy with like a UFO show who like suddenly had this weird UFO experience. But I eventually did sort of talk about it, because I also realized, sort of to Sean's point too, and just like in terms of getting the truth out, like I don't know exactly what it was, and hey, maybe it was a drone, and I was just like I freaked myself out or something. But it was very oddly shaped, and it was very weird in sort of how it moved. It was sort of like a balloon, like a lit up balloon. Um, but so that was sort of the that's the only time I think I've seen something where I really couldn't identify. It felt, and then I think so much about UFOs is sort of how it makes you feel. It definitely felt strange. Like it felt like something, as opposed to just like, oh, that's I just like couldn't place what that would be. Especially because it was like in the branches of trees, and sort of like, and then later on, like actually when we were doing the show, like we found out there are like, these cases of green fireballs. We even did an episode on them. And that's a little bit of what I didn't actually know that at the time. And that's sort of like what it kind of felt like to me. So I don't know. I don't know what that was.
Yeah, you usually don't try to fly a drone through the trees.
Yeah,
not-
right. Yeah.
It was very weird. It almost looked like it came out of the tree. Like it was very like I saw it was in the branches and kind of emerged from like it was very strange.
Wow, that's weird. Well, go back to the show. You've both worked on shows that are not based on true events, as well as, of course, Project Blue Book, which is. What are some of the differences in the ways that you approach a show when it's based on true events compared to a completely fictional story? Sean, maybe let's start with you this time.
Sure. I'm going to steal a quote, and I don't know who to credit it to, but you know what? I think it was Mark Twain. It's like, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And I think you find that out right away. Now, I've had I tend to love historical pieces. I've done a few development wise, over the years, Tesla and Edison, the Bonapartes. There's been a couple other in there, and it's been a bit of a learning curve trying to apply storytelling to what actually happened. And whether it is the network exec saying, I don't care, we need better television, and what exactly happened in that moment, or just an instinct from a storytelling point of view. Look, taking history and making a story of it, you can do a documentary, right? That's why they exist, because and a lot of times there's great history that you couldn't write this stuff. But when you're trying to make a television show and you need to sort of hit your act breaks and you need to engage an audience and you want to give your characters an emotional arc, you kind of have to, and it sounds like it's simple, but it's actually kind of hard. You have to sort of really give yourself permission to expand on it. Because otherwise you're sort of, I remember feeling almost, I definitely had a lot of deference to the history and the people, and you never want to mess with that. But at the same time, you have to, again, do your job and sell it to an audience. Feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I just think you have to have the courage to kind of get out there and really tell the story that you're wanting to tell, and have respect for the people and the material. But be a little fearless in how you do it. Otherwise, you're never gonna cross the boundary and just say, nobody's ever gonna say what a really wonderfully factually accurate television show. Do you know what I mean? And get yourself ratings in an audience. And I even know, like, something like the Queen. I mean, how much can they have been in those rooms where those people were talking and understand what was said? And lastly, I had a really good mentor. I grew up under basically Tom Fontana, who was sort of my mentor into the business. And he said, if you're going to do something historical, look at the history and then find the moments in between that might not necessarily even be written about. Get in there and use your writing ability to figure out what could have happened, what could have connected those dots, how could those characters have moved from point A to point B that's not being written about, and thankfully audiences are very forgiving these days. And I have to say, like, Quentin Tarantino was a big inspiration in a weird way. When I saw Inglourious Bastards, I went, wait, you can't kill Hitler in a theater. That never happened. And yet at the same time, I remember as an audience thinking, this is the most exhilarating thing I've seen, because it felt like he was having the courage to go, I want to tell the story that's going to get people excited. And I think if you set the table for your audience that way and say, look, this is inspired by true events. We are not telling that, accurately. We're inspired by it and doing it. I think you're okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we quickly realized is exactly what Sean said, that we needed to put entertainment and emotion first. You know what I mean? Like, people are going to tune. Otherwise, you're just going to watch a documentary on Project Blue Book. If you just want to know the facts, it's all there. You can read. There's wonderful books. We've read them all. But we needed to tell a story that about people, about human beings going through these events. We kind of quickly realized the heart and the heart and soul of the show was Hynek and Quinn. That relationship, along with all of our other, sort of 6 primary leads, the generals, Susie and Mimi, all that stuff, Mimi and Hynek. But what we found a way to do, I think, hopefully rather well, was take those kernels of truth and and put them into, and then weave them into a narrative yarn that was hopefully enjoyable, entertaining, emotionally evocative, while having but also encouraging people to be like, hey, like that, like, every week was a case that really happened. Within an episode, we'd have little Easter eggs of things that were really going on at the time. We'd explore other things that were sort of in the social fabric of the 1950s, bomb shelters and paranoia and like people tapping your phones and all that stuff. Russia's interest in UFOs, all that stuff. So, yeah.
Sorry, one other quick thing too. We also had Paul Hynek, who was, J. Allen Hynek's son, as a consulting producer on the show. And, that felt like anytime we were, doing something that made us a little squeamish or whatever, he would always say, which is wonderful. He'd say, I think my dad would love this, and so that really gave us a lot of, permission. It felt like, to kind of run with it and get a blessing.
Yeah.
Just for that topic, you're talking about UFOs, unexplained, right? And then government cover-ups, where obviously we don't know a lot of stuff that's going on there. Did you find Blue Book to be more challenging to fill in some of those gaps than completely fictional, because there is just a lot of it that we don't know?
Sorry, Dave, I'll jump in. Yeah, the thing we talked about very early on was that we're riding a line between, we can never say they exist or the show goes away, because the whole idea is they're searching for the truth, right? So that was always a hard line to kind of deal with, and something we were very aware of every episode. And one of the challenges too is, like, you realize it's not a cop show where you show up and there's a body. Our guys show up and somebody's saying, no, I saw it in the sky. You know what I mean? It's like, so how do you tell those stories, and give it all of that sort of energy and interest and a revelation every act kind of thing. So
that's right. And the thing we realized was that we had to thrust our leads and our audience into the case. We had to thrust them into these events to some degree. So things would happen to Hynek and Quinn as they would investigate a case that would often start with a civilian witness or a military witness or multiple witnesses seeing something they couldn't explain. The case wouldn't be over. It would lead down a rabbit hole of more revelations. But as Sean said, it's exactly right. We would always want to walk that line. Like, we'd always have like a plausible other answer, no matter how deep in we went. I mean, there's an episode early on where we go to Operation Paperclip. We go into like this hidden base, and it's like they're staring at what looks like an alien in a tank, but there's an alternate explanation there that's given as well. So that there was always this sense of like, am I seeing, which truth are you gonna believe, because I think one of our goals too was, obviously we wanted to attract audience members who were interested in this subject matter, but we also wanted to, we were also very cognizant that like half the population doesn't think there is much to UFOs. And we wanted to make sure that we presented an interesting sort of like dilemma where both sides could be like, oh, maybe it was, maybe the Lubbock Lights were plovers, or maybe it was temperature inversions in episode 2 in 110, in the season 1 finale or things of that nature. So that there was always this balance, because as soon as you just say it's real definitively, the mystery is gone. The truth is, the quest is over.
Part of Blue Book, from history, was to come up with some of those stories, some of the plausible explanations for that. Can you give an example maybe of a plot point in there where you did depart from the history that maybe the example that Blue Book gave and had to kind of come up with your own?
Oh gosh. I mean, well, there were certain threads that as far as we know, the Hyneks were never infiltrated by a female Russian spy, as Paul Hynek would say. I don't know. I don't think that ever happened. But so certainly we were adding certain narrative drama, but like what is well documented was that Russia was very interested in not only their own UFO programs at that time, but in what America knew about UFOs at that time, because they were like, is this top secret, technology, things of that nature, that we have yet to release. And we always were excited by the idea that like, oh, the Hynek family could be a soft target into sort of an intelligence gathering mission from Russia about that. And then things obviously complicate from there, because even our sort of Russian spy character is becomes sort of morally torn about like which side she should be fighting for, and all those wonderful things.
I think from a case standpoint, though, I think we always tried to reverse engineer what became the official explanation. like the Plovers, like temperature inversions with the stuff over DC. Even, Hopkinsville, where, as crazy as it seemed with there was like a monkey that was dressed up in a space outfit that's all based on fact, actually. There was one of the guys in the family worked at a circus, and there was like trained monkeys there, like, because in a way that's almost too absurd to make up. I would be embarrassed to like pitch that in a room. So I think we always started with something, that, we'd kind of reverse engineer it. And again, to go back to your very first question, try to sort of honor what was the initial, truth of the actual story.
Yep. One of the joys of the show for me was like when it would air, I would like live tweet the show, and I would beforehand kind of put together the list of all the things, all the cool little like, truth nuggets that we had sort of pulled from here and there, and maybe thrown them in a bit of a blender to tell a cohesive, compelling drama. But really to invite audiences to go like research this, like, hey, this really was a real thing, or like, this case is based off this event, so that there was always these sort of like footings that audiences could have, and like, oh, okay, great, and then they can go off and see the case. And then even at the end of every episode, if you watched it on History, there was like a 2 or 3 minute documentary piece about the case that inspired this week's episode of Blue Book. And that was sort of conceived from the very beginning, once we landed at History, to draw a line in the sand so that we could clearly be like, listen, we're not trying to deceive. We want to like tell a cool story, compelling narrative. But here's the root of where this comes from. Now go off and like, do your own research and come to your own conclusions. So it was nice to have that other sort of piece that would help plant it in historical context.
I like what you said, Sean, about the monkeys being that. I mean, there, and that's one of the things I love about the show that I do, being able to dig into some of that, because knowing that that's based on fact, like that's something that somebody could easily look at and be like, oh, well, obviously
That's
that
insane.
couldn't have happened. But well, yeah, actually, some of the crazy stuff does happen.
Yeah.
I think Chernobyl's probably like the gold standard in terms of trying to sort of tell like an accurate story based on a historical event. We again had to sort of decide early on that there's got to be a slightly different version of the show, and also just we knew too that and David had put it in there. There's so much family and soap going on too that we could also sort of lean on that.
Well, you mentioned a couple of them earlier, some of the stories that you got to cover, like the Lubbock Lights and Operation Paperclip. Area 51 even got Hynek's involvement in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. What was your favorite episode in the series?
Oh gosh, I mean, I would say I'm torn between 3. I think both Sean and I share deep love of the Close Encounters episode, which in many ways, in some ways, feels almost like the culmination of the show. Like you could almost like end it there, because like we end obviously in a very different way. And I was thinking about that actually this morning, of why that episode registers so much, I think, for all of us. I mean, some of it was just the magic of it all coming together, intercutting between 2 different time periods. But I think one of the things for us too is it was one of the clearest departures in tone for us. We were a rather conspiratorial, dark noir tone, which is like, I love that tone. Like most of the things I write are like sci-fi mysteries, supernatural mysteries. Like I can't get enough of that. But this episode, the case is ultimately has this wonderful sort of positive spin. You know what I mean? Like it so much captures a sense of wonder instead of a sense of fear. It sort of stands out because that's the other side of this thing. Like we don't want to forget that it's not just about conspiracies and being deceived and public denial and misinformation, all that stuff. But it is about the wonder of what's out there. And I think that episode in some ways encapsulated that wonder. And then the other 2 episodes I really love. I love our like big finale episodes. So like 110 and 210 for me also stand out as just like cinematic like movies. You know what I mean? Like I think Sean and I are both really proud of how those episodes turned out as well. But I don't know. I mean, like, I could go on. Like, we did 2 quote unquote bottle episodes. I think Sean wrote them both, which are also some of my favorites. That was Abduction in season 1, and I forget what lies beneath in in season 2, sort of the revelation of who Susie really is and all that kind of stuff. And that's we put all our characters just in a room essentially and had to tell an amazing story there. So I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, I love all of them. I definitely, the bottle episodes are fun because it's so character based, and the challenge of, we're a show that has to go out and look at UFOs. How do you keep people in the house in order to tell the same show? So yeah, those bottle episodes are great. Close Encounters, yeah, I mean that, and exactly what David said. The finales, just they're so much fun, and happened. That's the other thing. Everyone, like the Close Encounters, based on George Adamski, who was a guy who was just like that character, who we sort of had in the show, which was so much fun. And then, Paul Hynek makes a little cameo as a camera operator in the Close Encounters scene, which was so nice as a way, to sort of an homage to his father. And he was saying just even being on that set meant so much to him, and yeah, David put it perfectly. It took a break from the usual tone and showed the wonder of it, which was wonderful.
Paul Hynek's cameo in an episode about his father serving as there are so many meta parallels, because Paul was a consultant for us on the show, and then we did an episode about his father being a consultant for Steven Spielberg, who's like Zemeckis' close friend. It was just like for me, I'm just like, oh wow, like that's just like some incredible miracle that we were like somehow able to like pay that all off and do it some justice.
And it all just fits perfectly together. Just story almost wrote itself there. Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Well, if there is one UFO related incident, and pretty much everyone has heard of it, is the Roswell incident. And that's the case you started season 2 with 2 episodes covering it. Did you feel that because that is so popular, Roswell is so popular, it was more difficult to cover than some of the others on the show? Like, you had to be more accurate to the story in a way?
It was hard to do because Blue Book didn't investigate Roswell. That was our biggest challenge at first, was having to go back and you go, well, how can we tell Roswell when it happened, 5 years before Blue Book was even born? And so we kind of had to have a Roswell 2.0, but yet take all the facts from the original, and sort of make it feel current, And so that probably more ironically, more than any other episode, had the most kind of, I guess, would you say, fiction to it, because they never investigated it. Going back and sort of interviewing those witnesses well after the fact, and then sort of making it feel current. It was intimidating, but, because we're such research fiends and love the story so much, we knew right away it was a 2-parter, just because there's so much information in there. And, you add it with its opening season 2, you want a big sort of, a way to sort of come back in, which, interesting story. It wasn't our initial impulse to put Roswell as a season opener. And that, gradually through, breaking of story and then input from the network, we got to a place where it was like, nope, we're doing Roswell to open season 2, which was ultimately the smartest choice, as a way to sort of bring the show back.
Yeah, that's right. At one point, and for a while, actually, we really wanted to do Maury Island as our opener. I remember that. Which we eventually did, but it all sort of works out. Like, it sort of reveals itself as you break it. Like, we found a much better way to do it, ultimately down the line. I think that episode was like episode 6 or something like that. Of
5,
season 2.
I think 205. Yeah.
Or 205. Yeah. And, but yeah, I think for us, like, cracking the case on Roswell just became about, well, we'd done a bunch of research on Roswell, and it just became, well, okay, if a town was really, silenced and traumatized in this way, what would be the symptoms of that 6 years later? And once we sort of realized, well, what if somebody was trying to get the truth out of Roswell and staged like this crazy event in the desert where a saucer allegedly went down, and sort of, held held the U.S. government kind of hostage. Like, I'm going to unleash the truth. It created a way for like our guys to go back in there. And then the other thing we sort of had the revelation of it was like, oh, what a great character a journey we can take with Neil McDonough's character. And as a general returning to a scene of a crime, something that he's never fully been able to square, and also delineating, for those who watched the episode, between Valentine and
Harding.
Yeah, thank you, Harding. In terms of like who knows what and who might really be in control, because for season one we Neil McDonough is sort of the face of it a little bit more, but then we sort of flip the script a little bit, like, oh, perhaps Valentine, who's more the veteran, more the senior, is actually sort of hiding some things from Harding as well. So it was, it gradually reveals itself to us as we found a way to do it, of like, oh, here's a way to do it that really is interesting.
Yeah, it was really interesting that because I think a lot of people, when they think of the government cover up, it's like the government, and they're all in it together. And as I was watching it, yeah, I definitely got the sense that even these two generals, they don't know everything that the other one knows. And so you start to get that sense in there as well. Just really, really, really well done to put that together.
And so what's not, the general that wound up going into Roswell from outside was Twining, who Harding is based on, and was credited a lot with, some of those strong arm tactics that were used. And the idea of when Brazel gets brought onto the base, the idea of somebody who had been in charge of terrorizing an entire town. And again, I'd encourage anybody who has even an inkling of curiosity to go to look at it. There are plenty of firsthand accounts of people who were there. And then, are you going to choose to believe somebody saying, I was there, my life was threatened by a military official, and I was told if I spoke, I would be killed? And go, okay, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of those witnesses who came forward and said the exact same thing. So you have to ask yourself, am I going to choose to believe they're all crazy? They're all making this up for the sake of, a story. It's fascinating. And also with, Valentine, who was based on Hoyt Vandenberg, ultimately he went on to be part of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was like an ultra super secret, in charge of our nuclear program. And I think did he become head of CIA or was brought into the CIA or something? So it felt like we were fortunate enough to find this truth in the history and really try to bring it out in the storytelling.
Yep. There is a petition going now to bring the show back for a third season. I'll make sure to add a link to it in the show notes if anybody wants to sign it. But let's say that petition is successful and you're able to make a third season of Project Blue Book. Have you thought about some other stories that you might like to cover that you didn't get to in the first two?
David. Oh, God. Only a little bit, right? Well, some of the fans may notice, but other listeners may not. We actually had a third season writer's room that ended where we basically broke all of season 3. So for us, it's been particularly hard, I think, to, and then basically COVID hit. And I mean, literally, like the last day of our writer's room was like the day, like kind of the world shut down. Like it was lockdown in March of 2020, mid-March of 2020. So yes, I mean, we have, listen, we would love nothing more than to continue that journey. So especially because for us, in a weird way, the show lives in our heads, like a season at the end of season, like we kind of knew where we were going. We mapped out a whole path. And that makes it hard too, because I know how, excited Sean and I are about that season. I mean, that season is like some of our favorite stuff. And like, we were so jazzed to do it. Like, so,
and I mean, we can tease it a little bit too, because it's, it felt that, it felt like such a natural progression. Again, also history on our side. There was the great UFO wave of 1953, 54 in Europe. Yeah. And so we decided to go, sort of make it bigger. And, a lot of it takes place over in Europe. because that's where the sightings were. It went from like, a handful of sightings in Europe to thousands a day. All of a sudden, it was like off the charts. And when you dig into the history of Europe and the history of some of those cases, again, for us, it felt like this is what the show is. It is about the phenomenon, and it's not just an American phenomenon; it's a worldwide phenomenon. And so we got to explore some seminal cases, and it really did. I mean, like anything, it felt like we were hitting our stride, and we broke every single episode. So
Yeah, but there's some wonderful, England, France,
Italy,
Italy,
Russia. Yeah.
Like it was just like it was we went
Heartbreaking.
big. Yeah, it was heartbreaking. Utterly heartbreaking. Utterly heartbreaking.
Well, hopefully we'll get to see some of that in the future. But
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about Dr. Hynek's perspective on UFOs, because in the Real Project Blue Book, he kind of started pretty skeptical, and then his position changed as he was investigating these. So as you were researching and writing and putting together this, did your opinions change at all? I know you were both big into UFOs beforehand, but did it change at all as you were creating the show?
What changed for me was doing research on Hynek and realizing how smart he was in terms of hypothesizing the multitude of answers that might exist, right? Even in like his book, I think like, the UFO experience, or, his numerous books, he would hypothesize, he like, especially with some of these cases that delved into like, close encounters of the third kind, or, seeing actual occupants or entities or whatever you want to call them. I mean, Hynek entertained every theory under the sun, from they are, interdimensional in some way, like the planet is also theirs somehow, to they are interplanetary spacecraft, to they are us in the future, to they are like, I remember like he spoke a little bit about sort of the robotic nature of how these creatures are described. Like, are we dealing with extraterrestrial artificial intelligence? Right? Like, on and on. And I think that I mean, I always love that, the notion that like maybe, the answers could be as complicated as the questions. We could be dealing with a multitude of sort of phenomena happening simultaneously. We're just not sure, what sort of the answers are. But that was the shift for me, was like, don't hang your hat on really any one theory, because it could be something else. It could appear one way, but actually be something else. And I always love that,
Yeah, I would say, if anything, to that end, is like, it only expanded. I mean, I was already, having had knowledge of it, sort of, believed in the phenomenon, and I couldn't profess to have the answers, but had certainly done the research. But if anything, it just expanded. It expanded the scope of what was possible, like especially with interdimensional beings, AI from alien civilizations. Are they even here? All of that stuff. The biggest thing for me that I found doing this was the sort of how the sightings ticked up right after and around the time of our, us basically getting nuclear capabilities. There are so many incidents of UFOs in and around nuclear missile sites, turning the missiles on and off, and in and around Los Alamos. Once we got the bomb, that's when everything shut up. That's really when Roswell happened. And that is one of the most fascinating stories to me, because to me, it's the clearest evidence yet. And this is coming from high-ranking military officials who've testified in front of Congress about this. Again, this stuff is all available to go. You can watch it, and decide for yourself. Yeah. Yeah. Decide for yourself if, like, the high-ranking colonel who said, I was in the missile bunker when this object came and basically cut the power, then turned it back on, set our missiles to launch, and we couldn't do anything, then took it away. Again, you can decide if this guy just decided to make it up and ruin his entire career. But to me, that's the clearest evidence. It's one thing for a civilian to see something dart across the sky and go, I saw something I can't explain. It's another thing for military personnel who are overseeing our nuclear weapons to have these objects come in and around and basically control them. Because to me, that's communication, right? That is like, it's them saying, we can do this to you, and now it's up to us to go, are they benevolent? Are they saying they can destroy us? Are they trying to start a war? Like, what is happening? It's not just like, oh, I saw something, I don't understand it. They're communicating in a way and have the ability to affect our world. That phenomenon blew my mind. And if you go down that rabbit hole and look at all the instances, not just in America, but in Russia at the same time, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating.
And it goes all the way back to the beginning of this phenomena. I mean, Ed Ruppelt in his book talks about it, how they would expect to see UFO sightings over like atomic detonations in the South Pacific on sort of top secret military sort of weapons testing programs in the 40s and in the late 40s and the 50s. So it's a fascinating sort of aspect of this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point to bring up, because if you put it kind of in a historical context, World War II had just happened. So there was a lot of explosions going on, and that didn't bring anything out. But the nuclear side of it does. It's just interesting that World War II didn't seem to really.
You had the Foo Fighters in World War II. Really, that was a sort of a big thing back then. All the pilots describing what these objects were, and we touched on that, I think, a little bit in the first season. And historically, it's not like UFOs began right then. Columbus talked about UFOs, So, but there was a clear like explosion of sightings. Maybe pun intended. Right around the time we got the bomb, that is when the wave just took off. And it's also where the military, had really, gotten involved. And again, it began with, why am I forgetting his name? First thing, flying saucers in Oregon. Kenneth Arnold, yeah, in 1947, which happened literally 3 weeks before Roswell. And one of the things in Roswell that is interesting, they did nuclear testing and around that, but that was also Roswell was the home of the 509th Bomb Squadron, which was the squadron that dropped the Enola Gay was in Roswell. That's what dropped the bomb on, Hiroshima. And all in and around there, the White Sands Missile Base, the Allen Mulligan, I can't remember the other one, but all those nuclear testing things were around there. And the amount of saucer sightings were just off the charts.
Wow, that's fascinating. I guess I never had put it together that the Enola Gay was there in Roswell.
When people think of Roswell, they always think of it as a kind of a sleepy desert town, kind of random small thing. It had huge. Roswell Army Airfield had huge sort of military significance at that time. It was very important, and that whole area it was a massive testing ground for top secret weaponry and stuff like that. So it's not I don't think it's at all, to Sean's point, in any way a coincidence that this was a hub of sort of UFO activity at the time.
Well, I know I asked you about your favorite episode, and it's hard to pick a favorite, but do you have a favorite story from the set as you were creating the show?
I have two, and I'll tell them really briefly. One is in Abduction, which Sean wrote, but he unfortunately was, for whatever reason, not able to be on set for. But I got to be up for like 9 and 10, or maybe he was up for a little bit, but I don't think he was up there for this part. When the character is recalling his sort of abduction experience, because it was what's called a bottle episode, we had to do it. We couldn't rely fully on VFX as we were trying to keep the budget down. That's what a bottle episode is. And our director, Alex Graves, had this brilliant idea of like, he's supposed to be levitating in a ship, right? And like sort of finds himself in this alien environment. So they really strung up, the actor's name, I think, is Malcolm Goodwin or Goodwill. Forgive me if and they strung him up and they shined all these shimmery lights on him in the background on a screen. And they blasted the entire sort of soundstage with smoke. And it was this magical alien kind of like experience come to life. Like you could not see in front of you the camera guys, or like, all the crew was so quiet, and it looked incredible. You're like, it felt like you're watching a VFX shot happen in front of your eyes. It was like a portal open to another dimension if you were looking at what we were actually filming. So that was incredible. And then my other, obviously all the like fun kind of anecdotal moments with the cast are amazing too. But the other thing was in 110, we blew up a car, and that was we all sat around and like literally had popcorn and like blew it up in a sort of a outside in an amphitheater kind of an environment against a green screen. And it blew up a nice 1950s car to boot, and that was just a fun day to see all that happen too. I have a zillion photographs of that.
I'll just say briefly, I think it was literally day one of episode 101. We showed up on set, and it was the farm what played for the farmhouse in the first episode, and it was early morning, cold Canada, and there was this fog that had just blanketed the entire area, and with this sun piercing through, it was some of the most dramatic looking landscape I'd ever seen, and it was the arrival of our characters through this fog, up to this farmhouse. It's like I don't think we couldn't have wished for anything better. And it was day one. So it's just basically everybody's connecting, everybody's, coming with their A game and so excited to be there. And it felt like, felt like the gods were smiling on us saying, this is the right way to begin. So
We talked a little bit about potential season 3, but in the first 2 seasons, was there anything that you wanted to add in there, but you couldn't for one reason or another?
Oh gosh. Well, we had like whole episode ideas that for one reason or another we had to scrap, there was all kinds of like, curious weird. There were sort of like UFO cults popping up in the early 1950s, and like we thought about doing an episode that sort of explored that idea about sort of like how people might sort of use this arrival of this sort of new phenomena into the public consciousness towards their own sort of self-serving ends, and how people could get kind of roped into that kind of thing. Gosh, there was there's always things. There's even within episodes, there's scenes we had to cut, of course, or little moments that like for timing purposes, we're like, we just can't. We got to pick and choose.
I'd say too, David, his early draft of the script, and it was always described as, X-Files meets Mad Men, because he had a really wonderful touch with the soap that was in there. And again, it was as much about personal life and Joel, who was the kid, there was even a storyline with him. And, through the natural process of any TV show creation, development, where the rubber meets the road, you got to start pushing things aside in favor of, the engine of the series, which is our 2 guys in the cases. And I think we tried hard to make sure that we, with like Susie and Mimi and all of that, to kind of create, another world we could go into that reflected the Cold War era times. But for me, I loved as much the character stuff as anything. And I thought there was certainly more stories to tell with, Mimi and Susie, and to have a female perspective as well as a home perspective, and to see what's really going on, during the Cold War, back home. We tried a little of that with the bomb shelter early on in season 1, which was a real thing. They would put ads in the newspapers for that stuff and how the kids would feel at school. Buy your own bomb shelter. Yeah, buy your own bomb shelter.
You're reminding me of we came up with this whole storyline with Joel as like this 1950s boy kind of Stand By Me-esque sort of storyline with like he had a crush on his like neighbor,
older
this other
girl,
girl, and then like, but then you get to sort of explore the fear of Russia and the Cold War through the lens of children. The irony being, of course, that while they're like sitting while Joel's at his neighbor's, there really is a Russian spy next door having dinner at his house. Like all this like wonderful stuff that like it just you got to pick and choose. We're a UFO show, so it was like you gotta. But it would have been nice to do some of those things as well, Yeah.
I forgot about
All that. Thank you guys so much for coming on to chat about Project Blue Book. I know until there's a season 3, hopefully there'll be a season 3. But until then, can you share a little bit about what you guys are working on?
Sure. Well, I mean, again, it's the world is such a passion for us. David and I are working on something right now that we're don't want to say too much because we're in the early stages of, let's say, negotiations. But it's back in the UFO world, and we look forward to bringing those stories back to television, hopefully in the coming year, I should say. So if Blue Book whet our appetite, we're excited to serve another meal coming up soon.
Yeah, we just wanted to also give, in regards to the Save Blue Book campaign, a huge shout out to Carson, who has led that effort. I know we created a website called savebluebook.com, which is amazing. And just a wonderful way that he's collected so many, artifacts from the show and imagery from the show, and all of our fans who, remind us that the show mattered to them, because that is the most important thing. And that's why we did it. So we're forever grateful. We never give up hope. You just never know. You just never know what's going to happen. So we have a season 3 ready when as soon as someone's ready to take it on. So, thank you to all the fans.
Thanks again so much for your time, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You're wonderful. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks, everybody.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. What did you think of this huge mega episode about the History Channel's Project Blue Book? Let me know if you'd like to see more of these style longer episodes in the future. We've got one more answer for 2 truths and a lie to uncover, and as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie from my chat with David and Sean. Number 1. They wrote a season 3 of Project Blue Book telling stories beyond the United States. Number 2. The Roswell incident was made famous by Project Blue Book. Number 3. David and Sean have both had unexplained experiences. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Here's the answer in the envelope, so let's open that up. And the lie this time is number 2. Even though the History Channel's Project Blue Book starts off season 2 with the Roswell incident, in the true story, the U.S. government's Project Blue Book did not investigate the Roswell incident like we see in the TV series. And that's mostly because of the timeline. The Roswell incident occurred in 1947, but it wasn't until the 1950s that Project Blue Book itself became a thing. Remember, there was Project Sign and Project Grudge. And then really it wasn't until the 1970s, I believe it was 1978, that Roswell started to get popular after an interview with ufologist Stanton Friedman. And he interviewed a then retired U.S. Air Force officer named Jesse Marcel. Marcel was one of the soldiers who helped take the debris from the ranch in Roswell. And then he stated that the official explanation that it was a weather balloon was a cover story. And he actually believed it was extraterrestrial. From there, the stories and theories started to swirl. So, throughout the 3 episodes today, we played 3 separate games of 2 truths and a lie. And the lies were 1, 3, and 2, respectively. How'd you do? Did you get all 3 correct? Head on over to basedonatruestorypodcast.com/Discord and let me know how you did. As always, you'll find that link in the show notes with all of the other links for this episode, as well as on the show's home on the web over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/376. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Rob and David and Sean and me today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.